Two of them will probably deserve a lot of discussion. The first agenda item today is my opening remarks and any general comments. I guess all I'd like to say is that there's been a lot of work that has gone into looking at the formula funding recommendations, and the advisory committees have done a great job, and I want to express our appreciation to them, and we're going to ask them to come up and provide testimony here in just a couple of minutes. But I think that we have called them back in numerous times now to talk about these recommendations, and we're really appreciative for all that hard work. As I mentioned, the first item is the consideration of a commissioner's recommendation for the funding formulas, which will be used by the governor and the LBB in terms of making appropriations for recommendations to the appropriate legislative committees. And what we're going to do today is ask Susan. I guess, Susan, you're going to start off, you and Gary.
Right.
Will start off and give us a presentation. And then also we'd like to ask our panel to come up, Dr. Jesse Rogers, who has served as the chair of the General Academic Formula Advisory Committee. And also we have Dr. Pamela Anglin, who's the vice chair of the Community and Technical Colleges Formula Advisory Committee. And then also Mr. Kevin Dillon, who's the vice chair of the health-related formula advisory committees. And I'd like to go ahead and ask the three of y'all to come up to the front right now, if you would. And Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
Welcome to each of you. Thank you for being here.
We're going to kind of do a tag team. We're going to go through one area and let the appropriate visitor give the presentations from that committee, and then we'll give the commissioner's recommendation as we step through. But I'm going to start with a little bit of background information. So if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
So will you direct us which sheets we need to have in front of us
Okay.
today?
This is
Board.
the formula recommendation,
Okay.
and then you'll see Jesse's and Kevin's presentations
Great.
behind that. So.
Okay.
Okay, this is kind of a little bit of a very small background. It talks about these recommendations will go from this committee to the full board, and then we'll go from that to the legislature, and then the legislature makes and the LBB, the governor's office, and they make the decision during the 09 session, which is the 81st session this time, and then the appropriations go out to the institutions. It's important to remember that the formulas are an allocating. They're not for budgetary purposes. They are an allocation. Institutions are actually appropriated on a lump sum rather than an item by item. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and those are debt service and the payment of benefits, and those have to be spent in those areas. Other than that, the institutions can use the funds to pay for whatever they would like within reason.
Susan, come back one time for the board members. I'd really encourage you as we go through this. If you have questions, I'd encourage you to stop Susan and ask questions, because there's two or three of us that have been really living with this and I think I don't want to say totally understand the formula funding, but I think we've spent enough time with it where a lot of this is familiar to us. So please stop Susan anytime and ask her a question to make sure you understand it. Excuse me. Thank you.
And there are no stupid questions.
Yeah, there are no stupid questions.
This shows you a little bit of the change we've had between FY03 and FY07. And as you can see, the state in fiscal year 03 paid for, this is state average, paid for 40% of the funds. In 07, it was only 37%. The ones that actually started picking up the tab the most are the students and the parents. And that's one of the things that we need to pay as we look at affordability issues and that sort of thing. This is very important. Nationally, Texas ranks among the top. We're fourth from the bottom in the amount of state appropriations that's going and towards our institutions. The national average is $5,600, and this is per full-time equivalent student. And Texas is paying about, nationally it's $56,000, and Texas is paying about $5,300 per student. We've done a little bit of comparison, and if you look back, the current for the, and I'll get into that for the university. when we talk about the universities. So we're going to start with the community colleges. And the reason I did some of this background to put it all in context, to put some of this in context, is that you're going to see some very large recommendations from the committee and from the commissioner. But part of that reason for those large increases is because part of it is a catch-up for what the institutions haven't been getting and where they need to be in order to close the gaps and to not be continually raising tuition and fees. And so I wanted to put in context that there's been a decline across the past 5 years or so, actually longer than that, but there has been a decline in the amount of state money per student that is going to the institutions, not as a whole, but on a per student basis. And so that's where I want to set the context of this. Okay. And then I'd like Pam to go over the committee recommendations for the community colleges.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for allowing me to be here and make this presentation to you. And Commissioner, thank you for giving the committee the opportunity to work and make the recommendation. Our first recommendation was on formula funding, and we recommend that the legislature fund the total cost of instruction in the community and technical colleges in partnership with local funding efforts to support institutional infrastructure. The committee recommends that 100% of the formula minus tuition be funded for 2010-2011. And our recommendation is on attempted contact hours. The committee supports the commissioner and his proposal to change the funding mechanism for community colleges, but have concern over changing it immediately. Our concern is based on the possibility of some unforeseen consequences that might result from the change in allocation methodology that would exclude some of the main elements of the mission of Texas community and technical colleges. So we would like to see either a phase-in or a period of study before we move from attempted to completed contact hours. Recommendation 2 is continued funding of a 10% premium in the critical fields of computer science, engineering, mathematics, physical science, nursing, allied health, life sciences, and teacher education and certification. Recommendation 3 on developmental education. The committee recommends that developmental courses be funded with a 10% premium and a review be conducted to specifically identify ways that non-course-based remediation could be funded. And there are a number of community colleges in the state that are participating in achieving the dream, and some very significant work has been done in analyzing what's happening in developmental education and why we're not seeing the results that we would hope to see in developmental education. I had a long-time developmental reading teacher come in to present me with her retirement letter this week, and her comment to me was the challenge was not in teaching. The challenge was in keeping these students in school and in class because of the obstacles they face. It's not a desire they have the desire to get a higher education, but they're faced with work conflicts. They have to work to be able to stay in school. If their work schedule changes, they may have to drop out of school. If they have family emergencies, many of them are single parents raising young children. If they have health emergencies, most of them don't have health insurance, and so their health crisis, most of them are taking care, many of them of elderly parents, and a health crisis there will require them to drop out of school for a semester. So significant concerns in being able to keep those students in developmental education to where they do become a completer. Recommendation 4, we had a charge to look at our group health care benefits, and our recommendation that would be that the legislature continue to fund group health benefits in the way it has historically for 2 reasons. First, separating community and technical colleges from the other institutions of higher learning has no benefit and might exacerbate a feeling of inequity among different types of institutions. Second, the committee does not feel it appropriate to consider funding group health benefits through the funding formula, as it might inhibit the provision of service by the employee's retirement system and lead to reduced funding based on contact hours and not employees covered. Recommendation 5 on the nursing growth supplement. There are 34 nursing programs at community colleges in Texas, 16 of which did not receive funding in recognition of program outcomes. Yet all the colleges are impacted by very high nursing program cost. So our recommendation on nursing growth would be to fund nursing growth and address it through the funding formula rather than via a supplement. Recommendation 6, a small school supplement. Using a cutoff of 3 million contact hours, provide a small school supplement for all of those community and technical colleges that generate less than 3 million contact hours per year. The supplement would focus on administrative cost and would pay schools an amount equal to the difference between the sum of $2 million plus approximately $260 per contact hour and a standard administrative funding rate of approximately $326 per contact hour.
Pam, can I interrupt for
Yes,
1
sir.
minute? I see it. We've got so much paper up here. There's a great sheet, summary for the board, that shows the top community college formula funding recommendations. And as Pam's going down this, these are the bullet points she's going. Mine looks a little different. I printed it off at home, but it's on a regular size. But if you follow this down, and those are the bullet points she's going down. It'll help you to follow those specific recommendations as they go down. Everybody find that? Okay. Laurie?
It's on your,
It's on your right-hand
it should be
side.
on your
That's
right-hand
That's it
side.
right there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that'll help everybody as she goes through side by side. Excuse me, ma'am, thank you very much.
And our recommendation is not to fund that full supplement, but to start out with $7 million per year in supplement, which is 25% of the total amount that would be calculated from the supplement. And then recommendation 7 on alternative teacher certification. The committee recommends that the state provide funding for alternative teacher certification. And we recommend that the funds be trusteed to the coordinating board and be distributed to the schools based on the number of teaching certificates awarded. That concludes our recommendations.
Thank you very much, Pam. I'm going to now ask Gary to go through the commissioner's recommendations. Gary Johnstone.
Okay. On formula funding, the commissioner's recommendation is to fund 100% of the median cost level as determined by the cost study that was done this year, and to set those rates on the median rate for the 50 institutions. The hours, the contact hours funded would be based on completed hours, which would mean that the date that the census would be taken for funding would be the end of the semester rather than the 12th class day. The second recommendation is to include funds for performance-based funding. This would be a new part of the base formula for community colleges where based on the awarded certificates, associate degrees, and transfers to the universities, that the institutions would earn a dollar amount per year based on past performance in awarding degrees or certificates or having students transfer. We're also recommending an amount to be trusteed for alternative teacher certification as recommended by the committee. And we are also recommending a small school supplement although the Commissioner's recommendation is slightly different, rather than including all schools up to 3 million contact hours. The Commissioner's recommendation is to include all schools that have less than 1 million contact hours. And that would reduce, that would also reduce the amount of funding. The committee did not make a recommendation on dramatic enrollment growth, but the Commissioner is recommending that funds be trusteed to the board to, as in the past, to have a pool of money that would be paid to schools that have a dramatic enrollment growth after the base year is calculated.
Developmental ed.
And on developmental education, rather than doing, the committee has recommended a 10% premium on course-based hours. The Commissioner's recommendation is to take the equivalent amount, which is $30 million, and trustee that money to the coordinating board to develop some innovative non-course-based programs in developmental ed to try to improve the success of developmental ed in community colleges, where 95% of the developmental ed is conducted.
What I think I think it'd be appropriate give the committee the opportunity now to address any of the differences right now. I hate to jump right into the academic institutions, because I think we're gonna get issues, somewhat confused. So,
We'll go to the next slide so you can look at the.
yeah, that'd be great.
This slide actually shows the dollar differences between the committee recommendation and the Commissioner's recommendation. And as you can see, the developmental ed dollars are actually basically the same amount as 30 million. It's just the way that they are distributed would be different.
Susan, a question I have is on the, I think we need to, and I don't know if we do this after Dr. Rogers makes his presentation also, but I know a common question is going to be this whole issue of completed hours versus attempted hours, and that is going to be both for the community colleges and academic institutions. I think that can be obviously a key discussion for the committee. A couple of points before that, though, in looking at the base amounts that's on the sheet that we've been looking at, the difference between the committee recommended appropriation of $2.685 billion and the Commissioner of $2.378, that's the page we're looking at. How much of the committee recommended appropriation can be attributed to the critical field supplement that has historically been in the base, from what I understand, but is being deleted this year because it's being recommended by the Commissioner that it not be included, but obviously be a part of the incentive funding pool, that'll hopefully be part of the next process. How much is
It's 100, in the recommendation from the committee, we've calculated that's $155 million.
The question I have for the staff as well as the Commissioner is, we're all hopeful that we will get incentive funding on a long-term basis going forward. But in the event we were not able to get incentive funding approved in the next legislature on a long-term basis, have we taken money away that historically we have been providing to the community colleges for these critical fields? I understand what the Commissioner is saying, but the thing that's difficult is we're looking at funding on what I'd call almost a two-legged basis, and that is the normal appropriation process and base funding, and then we've got potentially incentive funding over here that we're looking at. So I'd like to have somebody just address that, please.
One of the things that the community college does a cost-based development of rates. It's very similar to what we're moving to in the general academic area, where we're basing all of our rates of funding on costs that we're collecting from the institution. So, and we've seen a shift in the general academics also with some of the rates that had been set back in 1998, a little bit higher in some of the areas of engineering. Jesse, probably his institution particularly been affected by that. And so both of the formulas, of the way we're developing rates, we're looking at the costs that the schools are spending on the disciplines, and rather than in the base formula putting in premiums, although the community colleges was intentional premium, the general academics was just kind of a premium the way the original rates were set, and now the cost study is bringing some of those rates down. So the cost study that we're doing every year should reimburse the schools for the costs that they're actually spending on math, science, nursing, medical fields, because the rates are developed off of those costs. So if it costs more to teach engineering, that should be reflected in the base rate that we're funding with the formula.
Okay. So you're basically saying from those costs have been updated and should be a more accurate reflection of those specific disciplines in those critical fields.
That's the intention of our cost study collection each year, is to set the base rate on what is actually being spent in a discipline relative to other disciplines that are taught at this university or college.
Well, let me make a few comments about our general approach to formula funding that applies across the board, not only to community colleges, but the other categories of institutions as well. What we're recommending that the board do is that we go to formula funding that is based to a larger extent on outputs. That we want to encourage institutions to give more attention in a focused, sustained manner to achieving the goals of closing the gaps. We recognize that there are a lot of variables in determining whether students stay in school, and we know that students in community colleges are particularly sensitive and vulnerable to those variables. So what we have done, and we have taken into account every step of the way, not only for community colleges but general academics, is what level of funding would be necessary, what increase in level of funding would be necessary to protect institutions from a significant decline in funding if we were to go to these output measures instead of relying on the inputs, which is simply calculating enrollment close to the beginning of a semester. And so all of our recommendations are intended to allow a transition to an output-based method of funding that will not damage the institutions. We've taken into account that there will be some dramatic shifts in the way institutions go about their work. And so we've tried to make sure that we've raised the base in a manner that will allow them to make the changes in institutional culture without damaging or without significantly decreasing their funding stream. We think that these recommendations are all very important. We believe, for example, that it is quite true, as the Community College Advisory Committee argued, that there is a lot of developmental education that is done outside of regular courses. There's tutoring, there are learning communities, there are study groups, and all of those activities are expensive. What we're recommending, notice that we've asked for the same amount of money. The difference is that instead of simply allocating that money to the campuses, we've said we recommend that money be trusteed to the coordinating board so that we could work with the institutions to develop innovative approaches to developmental education. The evidence, and this is troubling, the evidence is that there simply hasn't been enough innovation brought to bear in developmental education. And we don't support the notion that we should simply give institutions more money to do the same things. If we get more money, we want to see better results, and we think it makes sense to trustee that money through the coordinating board so that we can bring in national experts, so that we can design programs based on best practices both in Texas and around the country that will induce the institutions to take a look at developmental education differently. We have there are tremendous degrees of variability around the state in the commitment of institutions and leadership of institutions to developmental education. There are some institutions that rely primarily on temporary faculty, adjunct faculty to provide developmental education, when the evidence is that you need your best faculty focused on developmental education to make a difference. We have looked at data from around the country that show that community colleges can make, and the same thing applies to four-year institutions, can make relatively small and relatively inexpensive shifts in institutional culture, providing more advising, making sure that before students drop out, that somebody talks to them about what their various options are that can mitigate dropout rates. And so our position is we can do better than we're doing, and we want to focus on outputs, but also make sure that funding is provided at sufficient levels so that no institution, whether community college or four-year institution, will suffer grievous harm. There will be some shifts in the allocation of funding, but we hope that the result will be that institutions will get the idea that they need to focus more on student retention.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, I understand that, but it always kind of bothers me a little bit that we're going to take that money away locally, and we think we can do it better here in Austin. I'm not exactly sure that's the case. And it's like anything else that we deal with, the devil's always in the details. So what kind of planning have you done, or the staff has done, in exactly how this would work? I mean, $30 million is an awful lot of money all of a sudden to remove statewide out of the community colleges.
Well, remember, we're not removing the money, that's a premium. It's extra money that's based on the work that community colleges do in non-course-based education.
Let me just tag on to that question, if
Yes.
you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, because
Sure.
I have something along the same lines, too. It sounds, on the surface, bureaucratic. Okay, we're going to take the money, we're going to keep it here, and it's because we know better, and we can't achieve the same objectives unless we keep the money. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Can you give us evidence to that?
Well, we're not going to keep the money. What we're going to do is we're going to bring in, we're in the process of identifying small programs around the state that have worked, have had some success, establishment of learning communities, of study groups, of paired courses and so forth that seem to have had strong results. We're very interested, for example, in the program that's been developed at El Paso Community College, where they work with the local school districts and dig into the high schools and try to deal with developmental education in the junior and the senior years. We want to encourage the development of those kinds of approaches, and we are concerned, based on the evidence of the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years, that unless we say that the money is for specific purposes or for some innovative approaches, we're not going to develop all the innovative approaches here. We're going to say, if you want to tap into this pool of money, you have to demonstrate that you're going to take fresh approaches that are likely to yield better results.
But why trustee funds? Why can't we have objectives and report cards or something of that nature? Why trustee funds?
Because the evidence of the past several years is that we're making very little progress in improving developmental education with the current approaches that are being used by institutions.
Commissioner, I noticed that they had mentioned using contact hours attempted, but it looked like we were a little bit silent on that. Is your thought still that we use completed?
Well, yes, we do want to focus on completed hours, but this premium is intended to deal with the non-contact hours or the course-based hours that students do in developmental education.
Commissioner, and I think I'm right, has this premium ever existed prior to this
No.
recommendation? Okay, that's one thing. This is, from
new
what I understand,
money.
this is new incremental funding being recommended that's not been there. Number two is, we still fund developmental contact hours directly under the formula.
Okay.
So if you have
That's
some,
not going away.
and there's I forget what the maximum is on a statewide basis that we can fund up to. So that funding for developmental ed is still in the base. This is new money over and above historically any money that's been in the community colleges that is being recommended by the commissioner to try to create innovative ideas to improve the job we're doing in developmental education. The difference is that the proposal for the community colleges that they would like to keep that money that be funded directly based upon their contact hours, whereas, the proposal here is to trustees. So it's new pool of money just being administered differently is the difference in the two.
We recognize, the staff and I recognize that developmental education is underfunded on community colleges, on community college campuses, but rather than simply allocate $30 million more to do business as usual, we're saying that we recommend that funding for those non-contact hours be raised, but let's make sure that money is used for different approaches. We will bring in, we have an advisory group of faculty and administrators from around the state who've been taking a look at developmental
Yeah,
education.
no, I understand it's a difference in, we're talking about a difference in how the money is administered.
Yes.
My point is, can we not get to the same place by having the money at the institutions? And what you're saying is, we've tried that in the past. I know this is new money, but we've tried that concept in the past and it hasn't worked. We think this is a more effective way to get to our goals. Is that what you're saying?
I think we could develop some demonstration projects. For example, we could encourage institutions to take a look and adopt some version of the El Paso Community College model. I'm not sure that the institutions would do that on their own. We're trying to say, it's essentially a small pool of incentive funding.
Right, right.
Commissioner, can you or
Where we've ended up on incentive funding.
Commissioner, can you or Susan also, I'm trying to look down and look at the net differences because I think that's a great way for us to address this. Can somebody address the difference between Commissioner recommendation and the committee recommendation on the small skill supplement, on the 3 million and 1 million contact hours?
Okay, certainly. The 3 million contact hours actually would include about 60% of the community colleges. We felt that it was important to help some of those very small institutions, but saying that 60% of your institutions are small kind of mitigates what small really means. So that's why we pulled it back to the
How
1
many,
million.
what would be the percentage with the 1 million contact? How many
It's
schools
7 of the institutions.
7 of the 50.
versus how many at 3 million?
60% of them, so it was
20.
28,
Yeah.
21, something like that.
Yes.
The developmental ed is also being taught in the
Yes.
And what is the dropout rate for developmental ed? Is it larger than for other courses, higher than for other courses?
It is,
I would think it would,
it's extremely high. We made a presentation, for example, to the Senate a couple of weeks ago that showed that the completion rate for students in math developmental education and those that go on to credit-bearing courses is 11%. In reading, it's in all three categories of developmental education, math, reading, and writing, it's under 40% across the board. 11% for math, and I forget what it is. It's about 30% for writing and 35% for reading, or vice versa. We'll find those figures and get them to you in a few minutes.
Wouldn't it be the case that in something like developmental ed, the dropout might simply be a factor of the student not having learned enough? I'm not sure. Maybe they should come up with another system for their courses.
Well, I think we need to develop better diagnostic tools. I think we need to do a better job of recognizing we have students who are reading at the sixth grade level and below. We have to separate out students who should be in adult basic education courses as opposed to developmental ed. All those are things that community colleges need to do, and we need something that would, as I say, induce the institutions to take fresh approaches.
Let me follow up on that for a second.
Just let me get one more
Okay.
question on, and you feel like there's enough time to make those adjustments?
No, I think that what we want to do in changing the formulas is we want to encourage institutions to move aggressively in new directions right away.
this funding is for the 2010 and 2011. It's not for this coming year, so it does give some time to make a few adjustments.
Raymond, how much money is currently being used statewide in the base formula for developmental ed?
It's, about $90 million a year, 93, 94?
As part of this recommendation, the
Well, what is it currently, Gary?
currently,
Somewhere between 90 and 100.
94 a year.
Yes.
So about 180 a biennium.
And most of that's in the community colleges.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, majority of it.
Over 90% will be in the next biennium. Universities have gone down from using about 20% of developmental ed funding to about 7%.
Right, it was 7% when we looked at it last time.
So how did you come up with this number? I mean, are we going to move the needle with this? You know, it's kind of hard to get it in your mind of where we are and what we're doing today, and will this amount of money at the end of the day really make any difference?
We think it will. I think it will. I think this is a sufficient amount of money to capture the attention of community colleges, and I think that they will be encouraged to try new approaches.
What do y'all think?
With what we're doing in Achieving the Dream, in developmental studies, one of the things that we've found, and we're tracking them from where they began through that first college-level credit class and looking at our performance. But we're finding that even if a developmental student is successful in a developmental course, our likelihood of retaining them into the next level is not real great. We've got to find some interventions to the non-course space to move them through developmental quicker. The quicker that we can get them through and into a college-level course, the more chance of success they have. So we're looking at all kinds of interventions, but might add that across the state, the community colleges and the cultures of the areas that they serve are so different. we have differing problems at the different community colleges in different parts of the state, and something that might work in one portion of the state may not work in another with those students. We're having to look at the situations of our individual campuses and the students we serve and find out what's keeping them from moving forward and then putting interventions in place.
So were we offering a statewide solution that may not have practical application on an individual campus basis? Yeah, I'm struggling with getting this in my mind, and so if you go to a particular community college, is this incentive money potentially enough for them to change what they're doing structurally with what the money that they're already getting in the formula?
I would say it depends on the situation in the various community colleges. It may only scratch the surface in many of the situations. And we have different student populations depending on the area of the state. The developmental ed in my part of the country is primarily adult students. Students trying to come back, or students that dropped out and now have GEDs, but they need some help before they get into a college-level class. So our student populations are different, and what might work in going into the high schools in one area, if you're dealing with primarily adult students in another area of the state, interventions with junior and seniors won't help the retention rate.
If I could, this is related to what I was going to say earlier, following up on Raymond, is that the one thing that staff has seen in the data that reflects this is that the state has tended to think of developmental ed as one pot of people, and the reality is that there are at least three. One is students who actually get through very quickly, and that's primarily who gets through, or those that are almost college ready. And the reality is they probably aren't best served by course-based developmental ed, and we need to get to a point where we can get them through quickly so we don't lose them. Another set are folks who really shouldn't be in developmental per se, but there's no place else for them, which are the adult basic ed folks, who we really need to really separate them out and say they need something very different. And most developmental ed courses are not designed for students who are that far either behind, or they just, I mean, some of them are in math, or it's just basic computational skills. I mean, very low-level computational skills. We need to recognize them separately. Then in the middle are the folks that I think most people think we're talking about in developmental ed, which are people who aren't, you know, they're further from being ready from college, but that they're really reasonably close. And there may be two groups within there, but part of what the state has to do is begin to think about those folks differently. And so one thing that's been talked about internally is just this, number one, there's a lack of money for adult basic ed, which is really critical, and really about the only real money to address it is through developmental ed. And so we need to acknowledge that. Another aspect, which I think at some levels coming out of the Achieve the Dream stuff, is something for the future you can't do now, which is the concept of milestones, which the possibility of funding to some extent on milestones frees you up to do it whatever which way, whether it's course-based or not, but you still have to prime the pump with some money up front. And I think there's some interesting data coming out on that. But part of the issue is that, at least from my view, is the state's really been thinking of this as one type of person, when there are really three major types. And some of what's being addressed in terms of differences from community college really reflects the concentration that's in each of those groups.
David, out of 100, we got $180 million over here. We're throwing $30 new million at it. Are we really attacking the problem in the correct way?
Well, that's exactly, aside from the $30 million part, what I'm talking about is the state has not really, in my view, attacked the problem in the right way, because it hasn't acknowledged the differences in the students. And I think, given what the commissioners recommend, there's a possibility to address some of those funds, which all of which would really end up at the institutions. And the institutions, I've been assuming, would be involved in deciding, you know, some of the areas to identify that.
But you've got to get them to use the money they're currently using, see a benefit in whatever new money they're going to get, and try to get those things to mesh together. I I'm really struggling with this. I mean, it just,
Well, let me take a shot at this, if I understand what Raymond was saying. Isn't the difference here that rather than just distributing the additional new 30 million across all institutions based on contact hours, the Commissioner's recommendation is to take the 30 million and target specific programs that may be at a handful of institutions, perhaps 3 programs or 4 programs divided into the different cohorts David was describing, and to try to have more immediate, deeper impact at fewer programs that can then become models, as opposed to simply scattering the new $30 million over all the institutions to just keep spending it the same way they have been.
The community colleges have made a compelling argument that the current way we fund developmental education doesn't cover all of their costs. We agree with that premise, but we are saying that rather than simply raise the level of funding to cover the additional costs, let's increase the amount of funding, but let's allocate the money in a way that is likely to yield better results than we are currently getting. We know from Achieving the Dream, which is severely underfunded, we know from Achieving the Dream that there are certain structural things that have to occur in order for developmental education to work. We don't have those conditions on developmental education now. One of the things that we would do with this $30 million extra dollars is we would require that the institutions, as a condition of being able to tap that extra funding, would have to establish those structural characteristics that will likely increase dramatically the level of success that they have.
but Raymond, if you go back to the discussion earlier, and that you have problems in attempted versus completed hours, what's that going to look like if we make this shift from attempted to completed in the developmental area? Have we drilled down that deep to see what you're going to lose there, what the community colleges are going to lose in funding? Are they going to be so severely crippled that, this 30 million isn't going to mean that much?
No, we've, once again, in regard to our funding for community colleges, we're recommending an increase in the base funding that would allow institutions to make these transitions with a minimal amount of disruption and damage to the programs of the institutions. But my feeling is very strongly, we need to change the way we fund institutions in order to encourage them to become innovative in achieving better results.
Mr. Chairman? I will tell you, I'm still struggling with the trustee funds concept because I don't think I have enough evidence to prove to me that that's the best administrative method. But on another note, the 30 million, well, I agree it makes more sense to target a handful of specific programs so you're not just scratching the surface. Do we have, and I'm sure we do, I'm just can't find it, do we have the goals for that 30 million in terms of the specific programs and what we expect to get in return for the 30 million?
We haven't delineated them. We've started to do work. We've taken a look at the results of Achieving the Dream. We've taken a look at results from around the country, and we have a good sense of what seems to be working, once again, in small circumstances.
Yeah, I guess
we will put those into place. If we still have some time, we would bring in an advisory group of people within the state, from outside the state, to help design these programs.
Yeah, because my concluding remark is it would help me to know that this 30 million is the right number. In other words, what is the whole pie here? Even though you're not asking for the whole pie, but what is the big picture, and then where is this 30 million going to get us, but what are the goals and where are the successes that we should expect from asking and getting this 30 million? And without having that information, it is difficult for me, and I am struggling with this.
I have one question, too. If we've looked at this on a national basis, and we've got studies that support that, what has the movement been at other institutions around the country or states where they've actually put into play a results-based plan, as we're speaking to right now? And what is the criteria to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they stick with that, to make sure that there are measurable results? Because what I'm hearing is we want to put something into play that will create measurable results, which in the past we really have seen very little movement. So in studying these other plans, has there been a 10%, 15, 20% move, or where does it really net out?
This hasn't been done very extensively around the country. In fact, I've received telephone calls from a number of people that we're going to. I received a call from a program officer at the Hewlett Foundation in California who said we are watching very closely to see if this approach works. Most of the approaches have not been output-based, and so we are moving. We are recommending a fundamental shift in the way we do developmental education, not only in Texas but around the country.
So we really don't have any baseline that we can really...
The only baseline we have is what we're doing conventionally now here and around the country doesn't work.
There are some programs being funded through HB1 dollars. For example, there's a course redesign related to developmental ed. There are intensive summer programs that will be in place this summer. There'll be strong program evaluations put in place for that, and they'll be evaluated by UT Arlington. And in fact, also Teachers College Columbia will be evaluating a number of those, and that they also have worked with Achieve. And so part of what's happening is to connect a number of these efforts that haven't been closely connected right now. So there need to be some strong evaluations to prove that some of these things actually work and do make a difference before they're, you take a whole state in a direction, because it doesn't make sense to do it unless you have proof that they clearly work.
Ms. Bricker?
Mr. Chair, I have a question and a concern, I guess, for the completed contact hours versus the initial enrolled, both for the community colleges and for the four-year institutions. And I would like to hear the concerns of the committee when you said a phase-in or whatever. And in addition to that, did you all take a look at the numbers, if you were to plug in those numbers, say, last year, of those that attempted, or those that enrolled versus completed, and what that would look like as far as rewards or penalties for institutions?
We have looked at our completion rates and know where they are and know the dollars. I think our concern is we've committed funds and we've spent the money up front. And most of the community colleges have set our final drop date very late in the semester. And so we've spent those money and we've done everything we can to keep those students in as long as we can. It would force most of us to have to re-look at when our drop date is. I think with the community colleges, too, the discussion over the $30 million, the issue has been that we've been so far away from being funded at full formula that we're spending the money as wisely as we can, but we've never had enough to put towards developmental to really address some of the needs that we need to address. And that's where, when we look at the struggles we have in keeping the students in school and know that we're so limited on funding already, then that would be our concern. And the policies that we have in place now at our individual institutions, we'd have to relook at a number of those and have some time to readjust those if we move from attempted to completed.
And what would that look like, or what did the committee talk about as far as some sort of phasing on?
We had looked at a kind of a half option,
Compromise?
a compromise, to where it was a phase in to where we had some time to adjust.
And Ms. Bricker, what we will do is, there's so much paper on here, but after we
We
Your
have,
Dr. Rogers' presentation, because to me, that's going to be probably the most significant part of our discussion related to both institutions, is completed versus attempted. But at the risk of confusing everybody even more, we have run numbers with some phase-in programs to show what that impact would be by institutions. And it's hard to kind of understand that without putting it up on screen and walking you through it. We have done that and are prepared to do that. I think it might be better to address that at the backside after we hear the academic institutions comment also. Commissioner?
Yes, I wanted to say that we have recommendations regarding either approach, that we could make the transition quickly, or we could phase it in. I think the consensus is that a phase-in approach makes more sense. We've said from the very beginning that you cannot make these dramatic shifts in the way we calculate contact hours without making sure that the funding base is increased sufficiently to protect institutions from grievous loss of funding. We also recognize that the phase-in approach will provide even more cover to institutions as they make the adjustments, although that obviously gives institutions, we're not likely to see dramatic shifts in institutional focus if you phase it in. So there are pros and cons. Among staff, we believe that probably the phase-in approach makes the most sense. But there is no scenario in which we are recommending this shift from inputs to outputs without taking into account the levels of funding that would be necessary to protect institutions from significant loss of resources.
But with the community colleges, it seems like pretty much everyone might be on, maybe not the same playing field, but a similar playing field as far as challenges. But in the four-year institutions, it seems like there's a wide discrepancy between those that would have a long time to get there versus those that would already be there getting incentive funding.
Well, the incentive funding issue is a different one. We're talking about...
Well, but that would have a loss as a result of it. Maybe I worded that wrong. But it seems like the community colleges, that probably everyone's going to have the same struggle. But a four-year institution, those that are mainly minority, those that are mainly first generation, those that are mainly commuter schools would have more of a struggle to get there.
We are not recommending any scenario in which institutions would lose funding. We're recommending scenarios in which institutions would receive different levels of funding, but nobody would experience a loss. That's why we're recommending, we calculated by which number the base would have to be increased to protect the institutions from loss. So we're recommending, if we were to make the shift, we would recommend a level of base funding so that all institutions would be protected. But how much they would receive above that level of protection would depend on how well they do in meeting the new standards.
And it seems that the community colleges would all be at that same level or similar, whereas the four-year institutions, there are many that are already at a level where they would receive, and others would be somewhat punished.
Now, no, not punished, but now that we put the recommended high school program into place as a minimum standard for admission to universities, we will see that there will be less variability in the academic preparation of students across the different university campuses, so that I think you're right, there will be less variability and impact. Community colleges, I think from region of the state and from one community to another, there's likely to be more of an impact. But once again, we're recommending a level of base funding for community colleges that will protect them.
And I think, again, we'll come back to this. That's a great question, Ms. Bricker. And I think once we can see a spreadsheet, we can see by institution what you're talking about and hopefully see, can we address it through some phase-in plan, if that makes sense.
Can I ask one final question before you move on?
Sure.
What is the percentage budget shortfall when we say there's not enough funding in order to achieve this? Do we have any idea what the shortfall is?
The community colleges for the last biennium, full formula funding is
Right.
100%. They received 56%.
Thank you.
Now, what we're recommending is about 70%, and that is full formula minus tuition and fees that they collect from the students. So it's about 70, 71%. But they received last time 56%.
And before we move on to the academics, I think the other thing that, from a big picture standpoint, is that when you look at the commissioner's recommendation, it's still a 39% increase in formula funding. Okay, now, so I think that's really important. I mean, it's a 40% increase in funding for the community colleges, which is saying what the community colleges doing are playing a critical role in closing the gaps, and by that recommendation, that's evidence of that. So, and I think last biennium, we did a similar action. I forget what the recommended increase was, but I think we got one of the larger increases for the community colleges that we've got in quite a number of years. So, again, there's a lot of details, but you got to also look at the bottom line recommendation as to where we're trying to get the community colleges. It's just some different allocations.
And that kind of, the recommendation does kind of go back to what I said earlier. Part of the big increase in the recommendation is to do some catch-up here from what they didn't receive to be able to help them move forward.
Mr. Shepard?
Wait, I think as long as you're talking about the big picture, though, the fears, from sitting where they sit today is that all these things are really good ideas. But if you, back yourself up a little bit and see that the state has funded a little less and less, each biennium, they're saying, gosh, we're not even, keeping up with where they obviously think they ought to be. So when we talk about new and different ideas, which I definitely think that we ought to talk about, they're sitting over there saying, my gosh, we haven't been funded at 100%. We've never even been close to that. These may be really good ideas, but how are we going to use our local resources, for instance, to go get some of that $30 million? I don't know if we've got the means to be able to do that. So as we talk about this, you try to keep it in the context. I'm not saying don't talk about it. I'm just saying that's what we're dealing with. So you get some resistance. People will say it's a really good idea, but, and I think that's what Raymond's trying to say from the big picture is we recognize some of these things, and we're making a strong recommendation. But obviously, we know when you get into the session and all the other competing interests outside of higher ed come into play, what do we really end up getting at the end of the day? So it's a tough balance.
Good point.
One very quick point. I referred to the completion figures. Let me just give you very quickly the percentage of first time in college developmental education students completing the first college level course. These are students who enter developmental education, complete developmental education, enroll in a college bearing course, and actually complete it. In math, developmental education, it's 11%. In reading, it's 33%. In writing, it's 24%. So that's why we recommended, yes, we have to fund developmental education at higher levels, but we also have to put into place some mechanisms that are likely to stimulate innovation.
Is there any concern that when this gets to the legislature that they might really like this to get out, might not fund your safety mechanism?
We understand that, and that's why we would recommend.
I think you went right to the heart of it.
Yeah.
That's the question, Leah.
That's it.
Good go.
Yes, without funding, without providing an appropriate base level of funding, the results could well be catastrophic.
So no wonder they're scared to death.
But yes, and they have every reason to be worried.
They have every reason.
We agree.
And we would not, and we will say as emphatically as we can that this can't be done unless funding levels are increased. On the other hand, we do have to try to find ways to encourage institutions to focus more innovatively on achieving the goals of closing the gaps. I think President Rogers has done some things at his institution that might serve as a model for the rest of the state.
Dr. Phillips, I don't know, we've called it, among about 3 or 4 of us who've been working on this, it's almost a two-tiered approach. This is our recommendation. Of course, I don't know if the legislature understands, but it's a subject to. It's subject to assuming that we can get this level of funding increase for the academic institutions and the community colleges. We would recommend this distribution methodology in terms of allocation.
It's like, if this, then this.
Yeah, and that's probably never been done, but as somebody said, the devil is in the details, and it's how you communicate it effectively to get that done. So, but you hit the heart of it right there.
Just to throw more of a wrench into this, but if every, she inspired me. But if every community college were in a taxing district, and their level of funding was such that they were receiving funding from a taxing district, then a lot of this angst wouldn't happen. So that ought to also be another if when we talk to the legislature.
Well, they're all in taxing districts, but the amount that they're able to generate in those taxing districts varies
But
considerably.
they are also serving
Oh, you're talking
service
about the
areas
serious.
that are not in the
Right.
taxing district. So then the flip, if every area of the state were in a community college taxing district,
There
then
you go.
perhaps, then we wouldn't have this problem.
That's a good point. And we're not going to vote on anything yet. I don't know if any of us know what we vote on. But Susan, I'm jumping in front of you. I'd love to give Dr. Wright, is that who's up next? Dr.
Well, I was
Wright?
going to give a little bit more background on
Okay.
just the universities, but that's all right.
Okay.
Go to the next slide. That's
One more.
just the total for the community colleges. The
And we're going to come back
39%.
to the community colleges, Pam, okay? So I promise you, we're just trying to put it all on one table.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, this gives a little bit more background on the community college, on the general academic institutions. The yellow bar shows, and these are in constant dollars, shows that the state amount per student has gone from $41.70 to $38.81. At the same time, the tuition and mandatory fees have gone up, and a lot of that going up is they cover the part that the state is no longer paying, plus any increase in their costs. So that's part of the reason for the going up. In fact, we've looked at some information, and institutions, general academic institutions, are funded on a per weighted semester credit hour basis using the matrix. And if you, this current for the 08-09 biennium, they were funded at $59 a semester credit hour, or weighted semester credit hour. If you go back to the 02-03 biennium and before, they were funded in the on a constant dollar basis, they were funded in the mid-60s on a per weighted semester credit hour. So down even to the semester credit hour level, they have gone down in funding. Now, like I said, total, they've gone up, but on this, where they get funded on the weighted semester credit hour, they've actually gone down in funding. So that, I'm trying to put in context again some of the numbers that you'll be seeing. Go ahead to the next slide. In the last, between 02 and 03 and 08-09 biennium, the funding that goes into the formula amount, which is what we're talking about here, most the I&O formula and the infrastructure formula, has gone from 87% of the total funding pie down to 82%. The TRB amount, which is the debt service amount that is funded through the legislature, has gone from 9% of the total budget to, or total amount appropriated to 11%. So more of it is going into the tuition revenue bond debt service, and then from 4 to 7%. So more of that pie is getting eaten up by debt service and special items. And special items are those funded amounts that goes to specific institution. It's not spread across all institutions. So that's just a little bit more background, and then we're going to switch over to Jesse's presentation.
Dr. Rogers, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Susan just told you what I had planned to tell you. I want to say it again, however. Let me begin with some really kind of a disclaimer. The Commissioner gave the General Academic Institutions Formula Advisory Committee 9 charges. They're all quite legitimate questions and asked us to deal with them. If you read our response, or the committee's response to those charges, it looks like we were just downright obstinate at times and not very helpful. We did not intend for that to be the case, but we were trying to really make a point about funding, and I think Susan has made that point with the numbers that she's put up. But if I could go over that again and tell you what influenced the committee's recommendations, I think you might have an understanding of basically our point of view. And additionally, I'd like to make 2 additional recommendations today because, as you know, we came back into session and we looked at issues that we discussed some but did not have a charge to deal with the first time we were together. And I'd like to make those recommendations today on behalf of the committee if that seems proper. And again, also, when I begin, it's going to look like I'm just looking backwards and not into the future. And the reason I'm doing this is, again, to explain as forcefully as I can the concerns of the Formula Study Committee and what we believe to be the concerns of presidents and chancellors in all of the general academic institutions. Now, in terms of numbers, and I'm not going to cover them exactly the way Susan did, although that's an excellent presentation and it's quick to see that, but the 80th legislature appropriated over $1 billion to the 38 general academic institutions. In fact, I think it was about $1.2 billion in new dollars for the 2008-2009 biennium, and that is certainly a significant amount of money and a significant increase in appropriations. As Susan indicated, though, of this sum, approximately 1/2 was designated for capital improvement and construction within university systems and for the independent universities, also medical schools and professional schools. Specifically, $320 million of that appropriation was for debt retirement on tuition revenue bonds that had been previously approved by the 79th legislature and then funded by the 80th. Additionally, $175 million of the total of the appropriation was allocated to increasing HEAF funding. The legislature's action on debt retirement, tuition, and HEAF increase were very positive developments, but I think that also points out another important issue that all of higher education is facing, and that is the fact that the cost of maintenance of our buildings and facilities is just going to continue to escalate. But the point I'm making is that very large increase, approximately half of it went into debt retirement for TRBs and for HEAF. And the HEAF for institutions, like for many of the institutions, was absolutely critical. We'd lost funding over the years, and we appreciate that very much. But I make that point to indicate that a significant amount of funding went into infrastructure. Of great concern to the Formula Advisory Committee is the allotment of funds for the basic operation of a university. And of course, this will be referred to and is known as instruction and operation and infrastructure funding. Only $114 million was appropriated for instruction and operation through the matrix formula. That's less than 10% of the total appropriation was appropriated using the formula matrix, and it was that's our basic base funding for operation of the university. No new funds were designated for infrastructure costs such as custodial services, routine maintenance, and of course utilities. And I believe I'm correct in saying that. I've looked through the state budget, looked at every institution. I saw no increases for utilities, and I think we all know what's happening in that area of costs, and I will address it in the charges that the Commissioner gave us. And further, to date, of course, We've not, let me say this, there were $123 million put into special items. There more money put into special items than distributed by the matrix for basic operation. Additionally, there was $100 million that was set aside for incentive funding, and the coordinating board, of course, was asked for a recommendation on the expenditure of that $100 million for '09, and I know that you're still dealing with that and will deal with that today, but we still don't have that funding. Funding of instruction and operation in infrastructure through the formula is there to provide consistent, equitable funding for the general academic institutions. It was used sparsely by the 80th legislature. And I think without doubt that shaped the recommendations of the University Formula Advisory Committee, and it shaped the recommendations that we made to the commissioner back in February. The limited addition of base funding to the base funding, I believe, was an overriding factor in all of the recommendations that we made, in all 9 of them. So at this time, let me go through the 9 charges given to us by the commissioner. I'll spend more time on some than others, just because I think some are really much more straightforward and others are more complicated. To begin with, you recall in the last session, I think it really became clear to everyone that had to deal with this that the matrix or the distribution is a distribution system. The formula is there to distribute a general revenue appropriation. One cannot insert, it's not driven by credit hours anymore. It is a distribution system only, and we were constantly asked the question, okay, how large should the appropriation for the 38 institutions be? And we forwarded several models, but I really think that got us off track somewhat. So I was pleased to see that the commissioner's first charges make a recommendation on the size of the general revenue appropriation to the general academic institutions. We spent probably 2/3 of our time dealing with this. We looked at multiple models, a tremendous amount of data, and finally decided to zero in on, I think, a simple, straightforward recommendation. That is to ask for base funding that would cover the cost of inflation compounded, and I believe we just used core inflation to get the numbers that we did. And also, we estimated enrollment increase and asked that that be put into the appropriation too. We further stated, and I think you'll note in our recommendation, that the committee voted to recommend that instruction and operation funding be a minimum base level of funding, and that it be increased by $478 million. That is 14.4% increase in an all-funds appropriation that from the current level. That's new money. And it's based on a projected enrollment increase for the biennium of a little more than 6%. The way enrollments have been going up, that may be a little bit high, actually. I think it's a pretty good estimate, but it's maybe a little high. Mr. Shepard.
Just let me ask you a quick question. On the other side, you're looking at $114 million when you ran that through the
Yes, that's right.
Through the matrix. You're asking for the minimum base funding of $478.
Right.
But on the second page, you're talking about it's not a 478% increase, or is it? I mean, it looks like you take the difference.
We're talking
between the
really about
470
an all-funds appropriation. If we, go ahead,
Right.
Susan.
Once the appropriation made, it's all funds, and then at the LBB, they actually subtract out the amount of statutory tuition and a percentage of the designated tuition out of that amount. And for the 08-09 biennium, it was about $1 billion that came out of the all funds appropriation.
I think the real issue that we were trying to get at, and no, it's not a 400, it's not that large a percentage increase. It's just the point that I was making. If you look at the allotment of funds for operations by the 80th legislature, $123 million into special items, $100 million set aside for incentives, only $100 million actually put into the formulas, and we're saying put that plus inflation into the formulas so we would have a base of funding to cover that.
Okay. But just going back to the instruction and operation, and looking at the $114 million figure that you gave, what's the increase over just that number?
That was the
That'd be
increase
for-
last biennium. That was the amount of increase that went into the
Okay.
formula in the prior biennium.
I think I can answer that.
Okay, but then-
114 was
forward.
put, that's right, we're asking that all 478, based upon enrollment increase projections as well as inflation, all 478 be distributed by the formula.
Going through that, okay.
That's right, exactly, okay?
That's what
And that be a minimum base of funding, okay, to cover the cost. Well, anyway, I won't get into that. I believe that levels of funding like that would have an enormous effect on cutting down this rapid increase in tuition and so forth. I know it's certainly many institutions that would be the case, and it certainly would be true at our institution. Again, the committee recommends 478 and appropriation as the minimum recommended level of instruction and operation for the 2010-2011 biennium, and the committee recommends that no dollars be allocated to incentive or success funding until the above minimum level of base funding be distributed by the formula as we've recommended. And I think that answers your question, Mr. Shepherd. Now, actually, when I finish today, I'm going to go back and modify that recommendation somewhat, since we've taken another look at it. But at this point, the position of the committee is the 478 should be base funding that would cover all institutions. The second charge was one that is frequently discussed, and that is to explore the advantage and disadvantage of establishing a mission-specific differential for distributing funds to the universities. That was discussed extensively. I know there's interest in that. Our argument against it is that, in fact, that is why we have established formulas and structured them, or structured the matrix, and previously formulas as we do. Lower level, lower cost courses create fewer dollars for appropriation. Graduate level courses in high-cost fields such as mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, the sciences pay significant more. A university's mix of programs and the level of programs they teach, it's got to be a reflection of the mission of that university. So we think that to a very significant degree, the formulas themselves reflect the missions of the institutions. And consequently, we've made a recommendation there that we not go to that. I know that certainly there's some interest in breaking up the institutions and perhaps creating a formula for each, but that creates some very significant, I think, public policy issues, and it really gets too complex, we felt like, for us to deal with at this time. And personally, I'm satisfied that the formulas do, to a significant extent, reflect the missions of the institutions. The next charge was to continue to refine the matrix. We appointed a subcommittee and did that. In fact, we find that there's great consistency in the way institutions submit their cost for purposes of analysis and putting it into the matrix, and we could find no significant errors in our computations, and the formulas have been upgraded based on the increasing cost. I would anticipate that when the formula is completely phased in, or the matrix is completely phased in, you're going to see very small changes in any of the elements in the matrix, because the total appropriation is so large that any 1, 2, 3 institutions not reporting exactly consistent with others could not have an effect on the elements in the matrix. But we were satisfied that we are all reporting our costs in the same way, and that there's no real aberrations in that matrix when one relates it to cost. Charge 4 was to continue to refine the balance of the utilities and the maintenance and operation components of the infrastructure formula. And let me skip on down and say, too, that Charge 5 was to continue to refine the expenses that are appropriately addressed by the infrastructure formula. This is very complex. Jim Brunch's committee did an excellent job on it. And let me tell you, the result of both of these charges was that, yes, the amount of money spent on infrastructure, the utility percentage has gone up about 2.5%. And the committee also found out that the institutions are spending, all of the institutions are spending about $91 million above the appropriation, largely due to utilities And that money is being, of course, infrastructure then is being supplemented by designated tuition to about $91 million. Although the charge did not ask us to do so, I think basically the recommendation is that we increase infrastructure formula by enough to cover utility increases, because I think we all know we're going to continue to see that kind of an increase. Let me skip on down to 6 then, because I think that is really, our recommendation there is quite straightforward. 6 was to consider whether funding for the current teaching supplement might be more effectively employed by removing it from instruction and operation formula. You see, our recommendation ultimately there was don't change it. But we, and I think I'm speaking for the committee, a lot of you were there and you heard our discussions. We're not tied, the committee was not tied to the concept of the use of the teaching supplement. The point that we wanted to make is the teaching supplement, that premium that we get for using tenure, non-tenure track faculty at the freshman and sophomore level has been in there a long time. It is clear that it does not appear to be changing the behavior sought, but the funding has been integrated into the base operations of the university, and to just take it out would again represent a significant redistribution of money. And I think our recommendation on 6 was don't change this, but basically I believe I can speak for the committee by saying just don't take it out of the base. Our recommendation is still an increase of $478 million, and that, I think that's a reasonable interpretation of the committee's intent in regard to 6. And if there's any questions on that later, I'll be happy to come back to it. Even though we recommended no change, we were simply saying don't take this out of the base because it's already being used by the university and it has been done so for many years. So it's been integrated into our operations. Charge 7 was to recommend a new graduated award methodology for the current small institution supplement. We made a recommendation. I think the reason we did this is and I can give you one example, and you know that there's one growing institution in Texas, and I mean increasing enrollment, that went over the 5,000 mark. They're being very successful in what they're doing, and they lost $1.5 million in funding because they were increasing enrollment. I don't think that's anyone's intent that happened, and it was obvious to the infrastructure committee and to the total committee that we needed to have a phase-down model for institutions that actually grow past the 5,000. The committee's recommendation was to lower funding as an institution passes that 5,000 mark, I believe, in units of 500 students, and continue to lower it by 20% until it disappears at a total enrollment of 7,500. I could tell you the thought behind that, but it's an issue that needs to be treated, but it's one that's really difficult to treat quantitatively. But that was our recommendation, is that we have a phase down for those growing institutions. It's difficult for an institution that is growing to lose that much funding because they're becoming a larger institution. Charge 8, and this relates to another recommendation, one of the recommendations we want to make today. The Commissioner's statement there is existing formulas normally addressed by this committee are designed exclusively to reimburse expended costs, which is quite correct. New funds appropriated for FY09 outside the pre-existing formulas, that's the $100 million, are intended to provide additional incentive funding. And that's the $100 million that's being dealt with now that has yet to be distributed. And the Commissioner's charge was, if we continue to do this, what would be the optimal relationship between base funding and a pot of money, basically for incentives? We discussed this extensively and decided that there's really not a quantitative relationship between the two. We basically stuck with our original recommendation and said, let's not deal with this incentive funding or success funding until we are given an appropriate amount of base funding. It sounds like some of the other discussions today, I think, related to colleges, doesn't it? And that was the reason that we made that recommendation. I want to come back and make another recommendation, though, that does relate to it, and I'll give you a preview of that, and that is the idea of success funding. that was generated originally by the coordinating board staff and the advisory committee and this board is really quite attractive, we find, to the general academic institutions, and that is that we base incentive funding on number of graduates, that we weight those graduate or that funding based upon high-need areas as well as high-risk students. And I will go ahead and tell you what I plan to say at the end. It is an excellent model. Everyone shares in it. It's simple. It's doable. I think that the incentive is definitely there, and I can imagine no greater incentive and no better outcome than to increase the number of graduates that we have. However, the reason we made this recommendation, again, was we did not see a relationship between success funding and our recommendation of $478 million for base funding. It's not that we were against that, it's just we could not see an exact relationship between the two. And finally, in 9, this looks a little unusual, but I think if you were there to hear our discussions, and that is basically what should the hold harmless percentage be? In other words, if an institution drops in funding, at what level should hold harmless funds be put in that institution's appropriation to bring it back to a reasonable, if there is such thing as drop? Well, we couldn't decide on 2% or 3%. We complimented the legislature on what they did in the last session and simply recommended that rather than give a percentage for hold harmless for those institutions losing funds, that the Legislative Budget Board inform the coordinating board, which informs the legislature that there are some institutions in the base bill that have lost funding, and let it be handled by the legislature. I won't tell you how I felt about that, but anyway, the committee voted to make that recommendation, and I'll give you specific hold harmless funding. So if you look at all 9 of our recommendations, they really go back to the fact that such a small percentage of funding for the general academics went into the base operations general academics. No increase in infrastructure with a great increase in utilities. Only 10% of the total appropriation to higher education went into base operations, and I really think that was the point that we were trying to make throughout all the recommendations that we made to the 9 charges. Now, there were some other issues that came up. I think this is important, and I appreciate the time, and I'll try to get to my final point now. During our deliberations, it came to the committee's attention that a change in the instruction formula, INO, funding basis from attempted semester credit hours to completed semester credit hours might be under consideration, and we know that they are. The committees noted that our preliminary studies showed I don't know how to quantify this, a very significant redistribution of formula funding would result if we were to do that between the institutions. Our original calculations, and I believe you have some before you now, would show that if we just stepped into completers at the end of the semester versus 12th day, and I think arguments about that have been made and they're sound. We've already hired the faculty, we've bought the supplies, our expenditures are there when we start students. It's difficult to make this transition in one step. And if you look at the redistribution of funds, and I don't have it before me, but well over 20 of the 38 institutions, 23, 24, would lose funding. A few of the institutions would gain significant funding, let's see, what was my other point? Oh, there were a few institutions that would lose very significant funding. Now, let me give you a case, and the reason that we're going to make the recommendations we did. We're not against the idea. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, when you say that,
yes.
are you talking about 08, 09? You're basing that on 08, 09?
If we just redistribute 08, 09 money on this model, you could.
So it's not based on what's being recommended by either the commissioner or the committee?
We were just trying to get an idea of the redistribution if we went to end of semester completers. And I was actually surprised at the amount of redistribution. And I'll give you some numbers that we had, and I believe they're consistent with those that the coordinating boards worked out, Commissioner, and I hope I'm right about this. Probably the lowest percentage completers in an institution we found was about 87% completers. The highest was 97%. I hate to talk about my institution here, I need to be diplomatic about this, but I was surprised to find out we're at 94%. I was rather proud of that fact, considering our admission standards, I think, are moderate and reasonable to be admitted to a university, but we would lose $800,000 in funding if we made that step at one time. And there are numerous institutions that would lose money like that. And it's not so much the idea that we need to increase our completers. We need to get students in and through our universities faster than we're doing. It was just to make this step at one time was another factor that would represent a change in model of appropriation. And that has become, I think, as big a problem as the amount for higher education. Let me skip on down to success funding. And basically, we made some comments that you have in your handouts there from the committee, or at least our recommendation. And that is something that I've already mentioned, and that is the concept of success funding based on undergraduate degrees awarded, and we're going to change that to undergraduate and graduate in the recommendation we're going to make to you. It was first recommended by the advisory committee of the coordinating board to distribute a major portion of the $100 million trustee. Well, actually, I guess that's an overstatement. It wasn't trustee. You were asked for a recommendation to distribute the $100 million. The idea of success funding as an incentive and would meet the intent of success in closing the gaps first came up there. It next arose in the Formula Advisory Committee's discussion of Charge 8. You remember that, and we were talking about what the relative size of the two pots ought to be. And so we had an extensive discussion about that. An incentive fund based on a success formula to reward universities for graduates with weighted amounts for high-risk graduates in high-demand fields. As I've already said, I think most university presidents and chancellors and all of us have dealt with, it's simple to apply, it is doable, it's relevant to the needs of the state of Texas, it is fair to all institutions, and it's an incentive that can be pursued clearly by all institutions. Obviously, we like the idea of that kind of success funding as an incentive. That's the basis of our recommendation. I have one more slide for you, and that is that we've been back in session a couple of times to talk about success funding, which the Commissioner asked us to deal with in charge number 8, actually, and we've gone back and done that. We've also talked extensively about the use of completer credit hours as opposed to 12th day or beginning credit hours. And we'd like to make a couple of more recommendations, and then I'll stop. In the area of success funding, we request $100 million for success funding over the increase in the base. In other words, we're saying, if possible, if we could do this, don't remove it from the 478, because, again, that represents basically growth and inflation. But we're recommending an increase in funding of $100 million and again, we recommend not taking it from the 478, and we believe that the allocation would best be done using a 3-year average of undergraduate and graduate weighted degrees awarded. And I won't go through the detail on that, but we've decided to recommend to you to consider graduate students too, because they are certainly needed in this state and throughout the entire country. We also went back and dealt with some base funding, and that is dealing with completers, and we made the following recommendation, is that we needed, and based upon the idea that we needed some time to study this concept. It's a big concept, it's a big change, and we came up with something that we thought was rather innovative. At first, it looks like a very small step, but we're recommending that you consider taking 5% of the total appropriation for the senior institutions, for the general academics, I guess we'd say. That doesn't seem like much, but that's $166 million if you take the total appropriation. So we're recommending that the appropriation be based on 95% beginners, 5% as a test, which represents a pool of $166 million, and that we take a couple of years to study and see if we can make any progress in doing this. This is certainly developmental education is difficult. Getting students not to drop, keeping them in class, we do need to experiment with that. We do need to do more, and I think we know how to do it. We just need time and resources to do that. We're recommending that we take at least a couple of years, or maybe 2 biennia, with this type of appropriation to study this problem, to see if we can make some progress in it. If we do make some progress, we'll stand behind the recommendation to phase it in and go in that direction. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry to take so long. I hope it...
Thank you very much, Dr. Rogers. Boy, the health-related institutions, you poor guys.
That's exactly the point we want
Y'all's
to
will be
leave
pretty
with.
non-eventful.
Yeah, that's a simple one.
We almost line up. Trying to decide, I guess, what time, why don't we, you have to take maybe a 5-minute break real quick, come back, and then let the health-related institutions make their presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I think it'll help us. I want to respect their time, too. Is that okay? Thank you. 5 minutes, please. Ms. Brown.
Music book is.
I guess he doesn't.
We will now reconvene the meeting, and a couple of things I'd just like to point out, and Ms. Brown has reminded me of this. We've got several other items on our agenda. I think it's highly probable that we may defer our last two agenda items because we really do want to come to a conclusion and a firm recommendation on formula funding, number one, and number two is we really want to come to a firm recommendation on incentive funding. It's critically important we get those two items done to make a recommendation to the full board next week. What I'd like to do now is now give the health-related institutions the opportunity to give us their presentation, and then we'll go into deliberation. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, committee members, Commissioner, on behalf of our health-related institutions around Texas, I appreciate the opportunity today to share our recommendations with you. I recognize the need for speed today, and I think happily our approach to the various charges put to us is pretty easily amenable to the need for speed. So I'm going to go right to it. If I could go to the third slide, this is a slide only a finance person could love, but it does, I think, really, it does capture a lot of the central issues what we focused on as a committee, and that is, I can really state it very simply for you, that if you look at the formula rates back when the formula funding began almost a decade ago for instruction and operation, for infrastructure, for research enhancement, in nominal dollars, putting aside any kind of inflation adjustment whatsoever, in nominal dollars, we have had this decade-long deterioration of support for education, for research, for infrastructure, and at the same time, and what I like about this slide is it does point to successes. We have, it's a little tough to follow, but if you'll see this, let's start with the formula-based rates. They were, the base rate for I&O for instruction and operation was $11,383 in 01 biennium. It dropped to $10,841, or effectively a 5% decrease. At the same time, we have increased collectively full-time student equivalents from a little under 13,000 to closer to 17,000, or 31% increase. So we've had this, on any kind of a per-student basis, reduction in formula funding, again in nominal terms, without including inflation. In fact, what you'll find from our recommendations, we're not even suggesting any addressing of the inflation issue for really the next two biennia. Similar pattern you see in the infrastructure support formula and the research enhancement, where again the formula rates have dropped really more dramatically in sort of per unit terms, if you will, predicted square feet or research expenditure. So we've had declines in the per unit funding, while again we have a 52% increase in predicted square feet. We have almost 130% increase in research expenditure. So what we're seeing here is a 47% reduction in research enhancement, with a contrasted with an almost 130% increase in research expenditure. So our proposed solution is I think very simple. We're for some references to two-step or two-phase. We have kind of a two-phase approach. If we asked to get back to halfway to these nominal formula rates for the coming 2010, 2011 biennium, and then get all the way back again to the nominal 2001 amounts for 2012, 2013. So, and then we ask for certainly consideration from that point forward of inflation kinds of factors. So that is really it. That is really what the 10 or 11 health-related institutions came together around, this sort of one big concept of we'd like to get back to, we support formula funding, we think it has a sound basis, and if we could get back to, again, nominal dollars, how we were paid at the beginning on a per student, per predicted square foot, or research expenditure dollar basis, we think that would go a long way to help us in the Closing the Gaps effort. There's a couple of smaller points regarding mission-specific formula. Only MD Anderson and Health Center Tyler have, and we're recommending 2.5% or average growth in funding related to those two. The graduate medical education formula, a more recent formula, the Commissioner has some thoughts on that, I know. We're supportive of his approach. Our only position on that was we suggest the prioritization of our initial comments of getting the base formulas restored before, we see that as a priority before more money is put into the graduate medical education formula. But we are very supportive, of course, of graduate medical education and the need for more residency slots in Texas. That summarizes our position, our recommendations. Thank you very much.
Susan, you might just, thank you, Mr. Dillon, very much for your presentation, and thank you for going through it quickly, too. We do not have I think, a side-by-side presentation on the health-related institutions, the Commissioner recommendations. If I remember right, they almost lined up identically, as if the Commissioner was recommending essentially identical recommendations to the committee. Were a couple of differences?
There were a couple of little differences. One is at the time the committee was meeting, we have a process that was established during the last biennium that if institutions meet a certain criteria that they would be eligible for new sites for multi-campus adjustment. So there's a $0.3 million, so $300,000 for a site that met those criteria that the committee didn't know about at the time. And then the committee did not make a recommendation on the graduate medical education, and the Commissioner feels that graduate medical education is very important. And right now they're funded at about roughly $5,000 per graduate student, and the amount of funding from the Commissioner's recommendation is basically we get them up to about $7,500 per student. And those are really the only two changes. There is one other line item that we place it with the general, with the health-related institutions, and that is the Nursing Shortage Reduction Program. It actually goes to community colleges, health-related institutions, general academic institutions, independent institutions, and it is based on increases in the number of nursing graduates. In the prior biennium, we didn't really make a big pitch for a large increase, and the reason we didn't is we didn't have data supporting that. We've now seen some pretty good increases in the number of nursing faculty hired and that sort of thing, and so we are recommending a $10 million increase in that program. And we put it with the health-relateds, but it actually goes across all the institutions.
Those changes are outlined on pages 11 and 12 of Susan's PowerPoint presentation. So, you going to say something?
Just real quick on the nursages, either LVNs or RNs, either one.
Anybody that's certified to be a nurse, it's an RN certification. RN certification.
RN.
Yeah, because it's associate degree.
Any other questions on health-related? Yes, Mr. Rick.
On the formula base rate, going from fiscal year 2000-2001 to 2012-13, it basically makes them whole again. But how does that account for inflation? How does that account for increases in medical students?
That is a per-student base rate. So that accounts for the growth in the number of students because that is a per student. As far as inflation, the committee, and Kevin may be able to speak to this better than I can.
Yeah, we were sensitive to the significant dollar amount we were asking for. We were mindful of sort of the context of what restoring even to these nominal pre-inflation dollar formula amounts would cost. So while we're very sensitive to inflation, we pay utility costs and escalating faculty costs as any institutions do. We just felt as again, a kind of a simple, focused approach of let's ask really for one thing, and that was getting back to this nominal dollar amount. You're right, growth and inflation will be other drivers of more dollars that are required ultimately, but that was our approach.
Any other questions at all on the health related caveat? If there's not, I know we'll have some considerable discussion on the academics and community colleges. I would love to start this out very positively by entertaining a motion to approve the recommendation for the health-related institutions. Can I have a motion for that?
So moved.
Ms. Mendoza, second by Ms. Phillips. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Thank you. Congratulations.
The others are jealous.
Now, and I'm trying to decide how to approach this in the best way. To me, there's several various differences in the proposals between academic institutions and community colleges, whether it's the teaching supplement, whether it's developmental education, whatever it is, but the obvious issue, major issue is completed hours versus scheduled hours. And what I'd really like to do is open that up for a discussion. And what I'd like to ask Bob to do is to, for the board to give you, and this was not planned, he was flying up here yesterday and happened to be sitting with the president of UT Brownsville. And she related a story to him about how they're looking at student success, and part of this has been driven by some recommendations from their governing body, and it somewhat falls into giving you an example of what some institutions are doing as it relates to this, notwithstanding this recommendation. So, Bob.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I really wanted to subpoena Juliet here today, but she had to be in New York, and it's obviously her story to tell, but I think it's a very interesting story. Obviously, we're all very concerned when you talk about a fundamental shift from looking at the way that the formula is funded, and you start going to completion of coursework. So I took the opportunity in flying up to Juliet yesterday to ask her about this, and they have some interesting issues to deal with down there at UT Brownsville. They have a partnership, which is unique in the state of Texas, between UT Brownsville and Texas Southmost College, and they actually have an agreement with UT, which, by the way, this board acted on in the beginning and then acted on again, David, about 5 years ago. I think it's now a 100-year agreement. One of the things that she's faced with as the UT board was trying to figure out how do we do a better job throughout our system in dealing with graduation rates and completion rates, and Juliet reminded them that she had a unique problem in that under the terms of their agreement, they actually have open enrollment. So it was hard, if not difficult, for her on the front end to say, we've got to look at the front end with people coming into the system, and we've got to raise our GPA, our grade point. That was not an option, the way she explained it to me. So what they started then to focus on was this semester completion rate. They actually took this step, as she described it to me a year ago, in the fall semester, and had lots of discussions internally, because the first thing they knew they were going to have to deal with was a drop in enrollment, which occurred, and it cost them, I think she told me, about $3 million. So they had to figure out how to deal with that initially. But she said Bob, believe me, it's been a very interesting process. We have learned so much about ourselves. And one of the issues that she raised, which is something that we've all been talking about around here, is the financial aid piece of this. And what effect does that have on a student that isn't making progress, and they find themselves after the second or third or even fourth semester, and they're in this downward spiral. They can't stay in school, and they have this huge debt facing them. So they don't have a degree. They have to go try to find a job somewhere, and they can't get out of the spiral. So what they've started to do at Brownsville is they're looking at this process a whole lot sooner. So what they established is you have to have a 70% completion rate in any semester, and you have to take a minimum number of hours. So if you take 12 hours, you've got to complete 9. If you're taking less than the 12 hours, and you've got to pass, whether it's 3 or 6 or 9. If you don't complete at the rate of at least 70%, you go on probation, and the next semester you're out. Wait, I didn't tell you this part of the story, which was really interesting. They got the faculty to buy off on this. Obviously, the administration did, and the students. And they went to the student body leadership, and they were all in favor of it. An unintended consequence of it was the president of their student body got caught in that trap, and he was out. But he said he never regretted it. It was the right thing to do. But to kind of carry it a step forward, what they do is if a student ends up not in school and has to lay out for a semester, in order for them to come back, they actually have to come back on their own nickel for one semester, which I thought was extremely interesting. And I'm not sure how that's all going to work out because, it's only been there for a little over a year. But the way Juliet described it, they have learned more about themselves than they ever knew. One of the things that I've been interested in is, as this discussion has come up, and I'm not going to pick on any institution, but I've been amazed at how many people don't know what that completion rate is. And I'm not blaming anybody because, we've all focused on the front end of this and participation. Now I think it's obvious to a large degree we've got to turn our attention to the success part of this model. So the reason I tell you this story is that it is being done out there. People have addressed it, and there are others. I know there are other stories about this. Raymond and I have had discussions recently about this. So from my perspective, is it the right thing to do? I personally think it is the right thing to do. Here again, as I've said before, the devil are in the details. How do we get there without causing a huge disruption and a huge loss of revenue? And both Pam and Jesse had mentioned it earlier. The one thing that I think that we have to be sensitive to is the financial resources that they have to commit out in the future. And how do we mitigate any of these losses? Anyway, that's the story, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure at some appropriate time we can ask Dr. Garcia to come up and actually talk about it. There is a presentation. I've sent some emails, and Raymond, I'll give them to you to take a look at. So.
And again, that just happened. Coming back yesterday from down the valley. I would say also, like Bob, I am very, from a standpoint, conceptually, philosophically, completed hours versus scheduled hours. I share Bob's sentiment in that. I believe it is the right thing to do. And I think the key thing is, if this committee so chooses to recommend that and our board recommends it, then I think what we've got to do is to make sure that we structure it in a manner that does not have a dismantling impact to a one-year allocation of funds where it hurts any one institution. It needs to be phased in. We've heard Dr. Rogers offer a recommendation of doing just a 5% on completed hours, 95% on attempted hours is what I I guess I'd call it by the 12th day. And one thing we might do is before we open up for discussion, I'd like Susan, and I want to be careful, I'd like to show the schedules we have at each of our places because I think these do a couple of things. Number one, they run scenarios for community colleges and academic institutions, and Dr. Rogers, you don't have that. And I guess they show two things. Number one is we asked staff to provide us a look at institutional impact by institution. What would happen if we added $100, $200, or $250 million in increased funding? The second thing we asked was if we were to do a phase-in that looked like 25% year one, 50% year two, 75% year three, 100% year four. So it's very similar to the way we phased in the cost-based matrix, which we now are fully implementing this year, to give a gradual phase-in. So what they have done is they have also made a run which basically says, looking at a biennium, if you use the average of the 25 and the 50%, that would be using a 37.5% completion, okay, for the biennium, to show what would be the impact on institutions. And Susan, you can just walk us through, and again, I don't want us all to dive down to our favorite institutions. The key here is to look at a couple of columns to see which institutions would be impacted.
Okay, the one on top is the community college proposal, and this had, the first column is the 0809 general revenue appropriation. The next couple of columns, 10 and 11, is the proposed, that's the commissioner's recommendation at 100% of completed, using completed. And then the amount of increase in the percentage. As you can tell, at that amount, everybody would increase their appropriations. Then we went back and looked at the 0809 plus 100 million, plus 200 million, plus 250. And this just shows where the differences would fall. And basically, the community colleges, there's not as much variability between them as we actually expected to see. They are actually much closer together. So at the 100 million increase over the 0809 biennium, there are a couple of institutions that would not fare as well. Kilgore College and Lee College are the two that would still have a reduction in the amount of 1.7% reduction for Kilgore College and a 0.36% reduction for Lee College.
So TSTC.
Oh, and on the next page, TSTC, as Gary pointed out, would actually take the substantial hit on that one, and they would have 11.92%. Their completion rates, and Gary has, we have, actually do have,
And this is assuming no phase-in. Okay, this is assuming you just
100%.
just do it with one time. Okay, this is the no phase. We'll show you what the phase-in would look like in a minute. Okay.
Gary's passing around, these are the different completion rates for the community colleges.
The overall title of this is using completion rather than attempted. That's what this is.
Right. This is all using completion versus attempted. And this is
The
adding...
current proposal is actually the commissioner's recommendation for the increase in funding, correct?
Right. Yes, the current proposal is what the commissioner is recommending. But this, and this is, as Mr. Ryder said, no phase-in, go 100%. So if you got to the 200 million, everybody, well, TSTC, even at the 250 amount, TSTC would lose a little bit, lose 4 million. And that's for the whole system, not just for any one campus. That's for all 4 campuses. Part of that is because of their complete, obviously their completion rates are not as, they're not up there as high. And this sheet that was just handed out has the completion rates for all of the individual campuses.
But does everybody understand this one chart? Current proposal is what the commissioner would recommend. If that I think everybody would be happy if the legislature approved the commissioner's recommendation, but you can see what would happen there if that were approved. And then we wanted to run sensitivity analysis to say, okay, but if we only got 100 million, but if we only got 200 million, 250. So that's all it is sensitivity analysis, those last three columns.
Right, right.
Correct.
Well, I'm sure everybody understands this, Whit, but obviously in his initial recommendation, he has already made the switch from attempted to completed.
Right, right. These are all completed.
Yeah.
Except for 0809. So, if you go back to the next set of, it's the one with the hybrid.
Hybrid
Hybrid.
formula recommendation.
This basically shows the 0809 appropriation, and then it uses the phase-in of the 37.5% for completed, 62.5% on attempted, and then adds in, it says success, we're calling it performance funding, which is the 100 million based on graduates, degrees awarded, certificates awarded, and for the community colleges, transfers to universities. And then the next one is called hybrid, and that's the total recommended with the phase-in. And then the one that says hybrid minus, that's the 0809 appropriation. That's how much of an increase that phase-in amount would be compared to what they received in 0809. The next set of columns over are the phase-in amount compared to the 100% completion, which is the commissioner's recommendation, and the percentage change there. So an increase would mean that, so for example, Alamo Community College would receive, under the phase-in, would receive $14.7 million over what they would receive if we went 100% completion.
They're favorably impacted by
Favorably.
the phase-in.
There's only one institution that is negatively impacted by the phase-in versus 100% completion, and that is Howard College. And they have the best completion rate in the state.
So Susan, excuse me for that, but let's take an example. Amarillo College, just to make this easy, I mean, I'm a very simple person, okay? Amarillo College, let's take Alamo Community. What this is saying is, if a phase-in was done, okay, they would receive a total of $193 million in funding.
Correct.
And that's as a result of using 37.5% completion, 62.5% attempted hours. That's what that's telling you. The next hybrid, what that's basically showing you is that is how much increase they would get over and above 0809 biennium with the phase-in. Now, that's assuming the commissioner's recommendation is totally adopted.
Correct.
Okay. Which obviously is the big
if.
the big question, okay. If I say this wrong, y'all correct me, okay. And then the next two columns are basically just comparing, the next to last column is basically saying that Alamo benefits to the tune of $14 million by using the phase-in as opposed to going to 100% completed hours.
Correct.
Is what that next to last column tells you. Okay. And then the last one is just, I can't remember.
That's the phase-in compared to the committee recommendation.
But I think the key column to focus in on is what does the phase-in look like? The one thing we run this with different levels of funding like
We didn't do the phase-in with different levels of funding.
Just with the recommended.
It's with the recommended amount.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And we can go,
Shepherd.
Mr. Chairman, and Susan, help me make sure I understand this, is that what we're talking about here is if they have absolutely no improvement at all, right?
right, if they make no changes to their completion rate, if they don't change any policies, if they, excuse me, if they use the handout that we have, yes, if
Right.
they have those same completion rates, that's what would happen. And that's, basically all we have to go on.
No, I
Even though we
understand
do know
but-
that some of them are making changes as we speak.
So if they do make progress,
They make progress, that amount will go
then
up.
these numbers will go up.
Well, it's
Well,
a zero-sum
it'll
game.
shift.
It'll
It'll
shift.
shift. Yeah.
It'll
Everybody
shift.
approves the same amount, the dollars stay the same.
Right.
I do think what we need to do, and Susan, and we've done this, Dr. Rogers, on academic institutions, we have the phase-in run with other levels other than what the commissioner is to say. If we don't get the commissioner recommendation, then what is that minimum level? I do think we need to be able to communicate, if we are to adopt this, to be able to effectively communicate to the state legislature, this is the minimum level of funding that we think we need to put this type of process in place. And we need to run that to the community colleges to see where that falls out, too. And I would just say, they're running a lot of these numbers late. They've done a great job, so it's not a lack of being
That's
prepared.
that.
We were on the phone about 9 last night, still running numbers, so I appreciate that.
So is the hybrid what the committee would recommend? Is that what I'm understanding? When they talk about a phase-in, they need this hybrid, and this is something that they would support?
They didn't, well, and Pam can speak for them, they didn't talk about any specific percentage phase-in
Okay.
at all.
So is this something then that should go back to the committee, or to gain input from them?
We can send that back. I don't know, we have a
there's probably a time crunch.
we have a little time.
At the committee meeting, we looked at a 50-50 split. We didn't look at this particular split, but we did look at it doing a two-biennium implementation of 50% completed versus attempted in the first biennium, and then moving on. The committee did not endorse that phase-in of doing 50% completed in this next biennium.
By not endorsing, did they actively express their views against it?
Their views, as I think Pam mentioned, was that they felt like that it needed more study time before they felt like a phase-in should start. That's correct. That's my opinion of their discussion.
So this would be a blend between what the commissioner is recommending and what the institutions have recommended is what this is, Ms. Brooker. Okay. Well, will you walk us through the academic institutions too real quick, and then we'll come back and we'll open it up for...
We have them in different order. If you'll go to the very last page, it's basically laid out similarly. The first column, though, says that there's actually no change in total dollars. It just goes to completed with the same amount of money in FY08. And then we have the add 100 million, add 200, add 250 million. Because of the big differences on the universities as far as their completion rates, that is where you can see there is a much larger difference if just adding 100 million, who wins, who would receive more and who would receive less, and that's in the 100 million. So basically, you would need to get to a little over 250 million, 260 million or so, to get to where nobody had any difficulties with doing it 100% completed.
With no phase-in.
With no phase-in. Now, if you'll back up one sheet, this shows what the phase-in amount, actually, how that would work. And this is taking the committee formula recommendation, matching the commissioners, which includes, and the commissioner's recommendation, this is the important part, includes performance funding, $178 million in performance as part of a base amount. And unlike the committee's recommendation for performance funding, it is based on undergraduate and graduates with no weights attached. And that's because in looking at it as a conjunction with the incentive funding part. So it is no weights attached to the commissioner's recommendation on performance.
Susan, did those of you on the committee get that point? It's very important in this discussion that we really are trying to differentiate between performance funding, which is part of the commissioner's recommendation on formula funding, and incentive funding, which is a different topic, additional money that has nothing to do with this. So it's been confusing because the term incentive, performance, and success have been used interchangeably. I know I've been confused.
We've been trying to call it performance funding. I see we still have success on some of these. So when we're dealing with the base for formula reasons, we're calling it performance funding, and there are no weights attached to it. And then for the incentive funding, which you will hear about next, we're calling it the incentive funding, just to separate. They're both based somewhat on graduates, but we're trying to separate those in our minds to.
I think in the minds of the legislature,
And then, yes,
that is to be
the
add-on
ultimate
funding above and beyond this formula funding.
You know, one thing I just mentioned, if you go back to our sheet, y'all's in color-coded the one that showed the university formula funding recommendation increase. It's really important to understand what Fred said, is that, to me, there are, Dr. Rogers, two significant differences in what the committee recommendation is and the commissioner recommendation. It's one, completed hours versus attempted hours, but also, secondly, is that the commissioner is recommending $178 million in performance funding that comes out, that is part of the base, basically.
part of the base.
The institutions like the idea of performance funding, but they said we think that should be over and above base and shouldn't be part of base. Those are the two critical elements on the academic institutions. And the performance funding, just real simply, all that is that every institution gets awarded a dollar amount per degree produced every year. Mm-hmm. And that's, that's the success factor. And difference, there's a couple of differences there I won't drill down into, but that's really important to understand.
Right, and as being part of the base, it would be predictable because institutions have a pretty good handle on about how many graduates they're going to have each year. I mean, go ahead.
So you're recommending 300 million base and then 178 in performance.
Right. Now, one of the things you'll see is the committee recommendation is 445. In the numbers that we had run, the amount of hold harmless that was given to all the 7 institutions, I believe, last time, were included into that base amount, and so it's not 478, it's 445 when you include the 33 million of the base. But yes.
And it's important to say once again that our recommendation still increases the base sufficiently to protect institutions against any catastrophic shifts in funding. So that we're saying we want to raise the base sufficiently to make sure that every institution is operating from a strong base of funding. But anything above that should be based on performance. And performance, of course, the platform is focusing on retention from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester. And then on top of that we're saying performance funding is based on completions of the program, of the degree.
Go back to this, the phase-in amounts. Basically, we have the same thing. The first column is what they were actually received in 08-09 by EDM. The next two deal with the commissioner's recommendation, and this is at the 37.5% and then 62.5%. Now, on attempted, 37.5 on completed semester credit hours, 62.5 on attempted semester credit hours. And this shows the success and how it would be adjusted. First one's the committee, the second's the commissioners, and then the hybrid amount and what type of a increase that would show over the 0809, and then the difference over the commissioner's recommendation at 100%, going 100% completed, and then a phase-in over the committee's 100% attempted. And that's where those, so you can see who would go up or down based on the phase-in compared to the commissioners and the phase-in compared to the committees.
Okay, again, let me...
Jesse looks like he has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Rogers.
We're off of performance and now on to completers.
Right.
Okay.
Right, this is on
The first column
completers.
is 37% hybrid.
Right, it's,
Well,
all of these are 37% completed and 62% attempted.
It seems a blended
That phase-in
37 and a
Based on
half.
25% the first year, 50% the second year.
But since you get money on a biennium basis,
So-
it's a 37
So
and a
what
half.
that's saying, if you read across here, UT El Paso, if we were to implement completed hours versus scheduled hours, UT El Paso, if we use a phase-in approach, would get $14.5 million increase if the legislature approves of the commissioner's recommendation of a $478 million increase in base funding.
Correct.
Is what that's telling you.
Mhm.
So what that's telling you is if the legislature were to approve what the commissioner is recommending,
Mhm.
this is the increase that every institution would get with a phase-in.
With the phase-in, correct.
Okay? So, and then the next column's over, just giving you comparative looks. Was it look against the commissioners 100, just doing it all at once as opposed to having a phase-in. So I think the other thing that is critical here is also to run the phase-in at different levels to make sure we can see what those minimum levels are too.
Okay, and we can, you want to go run the,
But you see what I'm saying, Gary?
Right.
I mean, we'll need
I don't
that.
have
oh,
the,
okay.
we can change the percentage with what sheet that like this, but we can't change, what I think you're saying is that if we don't get 478 million, what would the phase-in?
Future.
Probably run one of these sheets for each scenario.
Right, and we'll have to go back and run that
Plus
one.
100, plus
I don't
200,
have
plus
those
250.
prepared right now.
But
I can't understand that.
But I think it's, one thing you can look at is that the last sheet, which is the full-blown change to completed hours in the first year, if we were to go right to 100%, at $100 million, the whole pool still gains 3%, but 13 institutions are negatively impacted.
Correct.
200 million, no phase-in, 100% the first year. The whole pool goes up almost 6%, and only 5 institutions are negatively impacted. At 250 million, there's only 3 institutions negatively impacted. So you can well imagine that by phasing this in over 4 years,
It'll mitigate.
it'll mitigate even those numbers you're looking at right there. And at 200 to 250 million, you're already looking at relatively minor impact without phasing in. Well, at the commissioner's recommendation, no one is, these are what-if scenarios, is if the legislature did not approve
Fully fund.
the commissioner's recommendation and only approved a 100 million increase or a 200.
The 250 is still,
They're hypotheticals.
17 million, it's still 17 million below what
Yes,
our recommendation is.
That's,
Well, it's a lot more
Dr.
than
Phillips,
that.
we'd make sure that we identify that number, which is going to be obviously less than what the commissioner's recommending. Commissioner's recommending almost a 40% increase in the community colleges. He's recommending a 17% increase in the academic institutions. So the number's going to be lower than what he is recommending. And again, we need to determine what that number is, obviously, to make sure that
And
happens
this
with
does,
community.
these 100, 200, and 250 million do not include the performance funding at all. So that's another piece
On
of
the
that.
academic institutions.
On the academic institution.
So if the commissioner's recommendation for more funding does not get approved by the legislature, do we still go to this model or one of the models?
Well, I think that's for discussion here. I think my recommendation would be is that we identify a minimum level of funding that would be required for us to move to this model,
Okay.
is what my recommendation
And
would
that
be.
minimum level would be less if we recommend also phasing it in instead of going to completed hours in 1 year.
Well, and looking at the phase-in, if I'm understanding this correctly, on page 5 of 6, fiscal year 2010 to 11, just glancing all the way down at the percentages, they're all somewhat competitive, somewhat equal, as opposed to if it went full funding without the hybrid, there would be incredible discrepancy. Am I understanding that right?
You are?
Yeah. No,
That's a miracle.
sounds like an accurate observation.
Well, thank you.
One per meeting.
Bertie said.
I really think the question on the table is, and, we could sit here and look at these numbers for days, okay, but I think the question on the table is the whole issue of philosophically, do we think that is the correct approach? Number two is, would we recommend, if we were to recommend that, would we recommend 100% at one time or do a phase-in? And number three is, would a third part of that be that we identify a minimum level of funding, which would be a caveat to our proposal, that type of minimum level of funding would be required in order for this system to work, so that no one institution is going to get hurt in any 1 year going, and it gives them 4 years, if it's a hybrid, to work towards this. And I'm not calling the question.
we have heard some, we could phase it in, do one year and then reevaluate based on changes in policies that the institution's making, whether we want to continue to phase in or what we wanted, or what you wanted to do. That would all be based on what kind of changes we're seeing, and assuming that the institution, you may want to go from that point to just do it the rest of the way based on the changes that the institutions have already made.
And it's important to recognize that the recommended high school program as a minimum criterion for admission to university goes into effect next year. And we have data that suggests that affects retention rates significantly in a positive way. So we could expect that retention would go up to some extent, even if we did nothing beyond what's already been done. So this is, I think we can do this without having any draconian impact on any institution. And it moves us in the direction that we need to go. I would hope that down the road this would, universities would take a look at their admissions criteria beyond the recommended high school program to get a better alignment between their capacity to graduate students and who they admit. I would hope that this would encourage universities to think more carefully about their relationship with K through 12, and that it's in their enlightened self-interest to work more closely to improve college readiness in K through 12.
It also, you've mentioned previously, I don't believe today, Commissioner, that part of this also reflects how the institution interacts with the student when they're there, in terms of whether they encourage them to work their way through the course or not, and spending the time with the student. Part of this does reflect institutional policy, and better that it come from institutions changing their policy. We understand from one university that just by beginning to work on the 6-drop rule from the legislature, that they've had a significant decrease in dropped courses already. But it's preferable for institutions to determine, how to approach encouraging people to finish the semester.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I had a question about the admission standards. I mean, obviously, there's a tie-in here, and I'd like to know about the feedback you've received from the institutions on that issue. And also, are there any stumbling blocks or statutes or agreements that would prohibit these institutions from being able to change their admission standards?
No.
Okay.
Actually, just so you'll know, I don't know the data from fall 2007, but I know for fall 2006, 98% of the first students enrolling directly from high school at universities had completed the recommended high school program. 80% coming directly from high schools to community colleges had actually completed the recommended high school program. So that's prior to it being required for high school graduation. That was a year earlier. So just recently, we've had a large improvement in terms of the preparation of students coming directly from high school, at least in terms of the courses they've taken. They had a wide range of grades, of course. I think that's an important change. The requirement from the legislature for universities is that the recommended high school program be a minimum, and some schools could require more. At the university level, community colleges would remain
they all have
open
that.
admission.
I think that the biggest question before us right now, before we adopt the community college and the general academic institution recommendations, is sort of to call the question on what is this committee's philosophy, what is this committee's desire in terms of moving to changing formula funding to completed hours, and do we make it all in one leap, or do we phase it in, and if so, over what time period do we phase it in? I think if we can bridge that, then we can move into the motions that we need to pass today. So who wants to go first?
Dr. Phillips.
I have some concerns about how completed hours will affect the students. Because I can see that the way a community college would have to deal with this, unless we build in a phased approach that they're comfortable with and that they can project their budget on, would be to move the drop dead way.
Ms. Phillips, or Dr. Phillips, can you pull your,
Sorry.
they're telling me you're not getting caught on the,
So if the community colleges had to move their drop date way up, or from April 21st, which is ACC's, to, February, I think it'll have a negative impact on the student. Now, I'm hoping that, given what the commissioner has said, that the institutions will think about that and will, create programs to identify students who are failing from the get-go quickly and keep them in the course. But I do think we need to think about the students and the fact that some of them in developmental ed who are, will drop the course rather than fail it. And that's really part of the natural progression of developmental ed as it stands now.
This is not based on past courses. We're not saying that student has to have a passing grade.
I know.
It's based on completed.
Well, I understand that, but, that's why they don't complete it, is that they don't want to fail when they're just trying to barely succeed. Anyway, I just wanted to raise the student's point of view, and I think we need to be mindful of that. Ultimately, I agree they'll be better off, but just in the interim.
And I just want to make sure we have all the information given to us in terms of feedback and comments from the institutions. I mean, obviously, there's going to be some, but if there's anything else that has been discussed or said that hasn't yet been presented, we would like to have that information.
I agree with that. Bob and I were just talking
Wanna
that
make sure.
if we were to adopt this completed hours, I would want to say to both academic and the community institutions that we would like to have you obviously provide us with any comments about that. It's not, we'd like to hear that, and we'll welcome those comments.
Well, and
Absolutely.
I understand, the concern about the dollars, okay, and I understand the concern about the phase-in. Let's put those aside because we have talked about those and those are understandable, but anything else, any other issues that we haven't discussed yet or heard about yet? Okay.
And I'm still struck by what was said about whatever it was, 25 of the 30-some-odd institutions that would lose funding. Now, I understand that they wouldn't technically lose funding if they're made whole somehow, but that they would not be able to compete as much as other institutions could. And I want to ask for a clarification. Not being a member of the committee, we cannot vote on this until it gets to the board.
That's
correct. Okay, but we can comment. We can
That's why we
influence
had you, that's why we had you here, Ms. Brooks. As if we could stop you.
Then, my suggestion and feeling is that if we were to provide some sort of a phase-in, that we could continue to get input from the institutions, and they could see as it goes and project out what it looks like next year, and then if we needed to come back and visit this again, if it has a negative impact on still 25 or 30 of the institutions, then we would have that opportunity.
And I go even beyond that. I think phasing in is a good approach because it doesn't require going from 0 to 60 in 6 seconds, so to speak. But I think, as Whit said earlier, it's also based on the caveat of a certain minimum level of increased funding that allows,
Exactly.
so that number is not 25 out of 30 institutions.
Right.
And that it's, hopefully no institutions. It's at a level of funding that allows all institutions to, get their increase in base funding. Yes, some may gain more than others, but our goal is that no one is negatively impacted.
And whoever is on the committee that makes the motion, I would hope that that would be in it too.
Yes,
I'm
Ms. Phillips.
sorry to take the time, but I just feel like I need to understand all of this. Dr. Rogers, could you say a little bit more about why the universities are recommending that this all be on top of the 478 base?
Performance funding is what you're talking about, the $100 million.
Yeah. Actually, we felt like the base, it's as you saw in Susan's graphs up here, our base funding has been going down a long time. Tuition continues to go up. We know that. And we tried to decide on a model that would stop that, and what would it take? And we decided to base it just on base inflation plus projected growth. And it came out 478 million in the base. And then our decision was really very simple, is to stick with that because we really need base funding. We haven't had that. That's what I was trying to point out last time. There was just 114 put into it out of all of the money put into our education. So, I'm not sure I understand. Why we put it on top is basically to stay with our original sort of thesis or premise, and that is that we needed base funding and wanted to recommend base funding, and that base was 478. Now, I think I will comment on the Commissioner's recommendation, as I understand it, would be a base of 300 instead of 478, but put performance funding in at 178. It's a pretty good compromise, really, and I'm speaking for Jesse Rogers, not the committee. Okay.
Other comments, questions? What I would like to do is, and we need to be able to put this in a form of a motion, and I'm not trying to cut off conversation. We're already at noon anyway. We've been going 3 hours. We might as well go 2 more hours. So, but I really do not want to stifle the conversation here, and I mean that sincerely. But I think what I'm hearing around the table, and I don't know if I'm seeing nodding of heads, and it's not form, but I'm seeing.
It's because of nodding off.
Or nodding off. is what I'm hearing some consensus is going to a completed hours type measure, subject to a phase-in like we've talked about, and subject to making sure that we identify a minimum level of funding that this recommendation would be subject to. And we need to run that, obviously, with the phase-in model to see what that looks like. Am I getting nods around the table? I'm not asking that for a motion. If that's the case, then what I'd say is I'd like to just very briefly look at to ask, let's take two different pieces. Let's look at the community college piece first and see, can we get a motion on the table for the community college formula funding recommendations, and then we'll go to the academic institutions, because the completed hours is a common theme for both of them. And I will just go down, the key differences I will just mention in the community college. If you look at, going back to your summary sheet, okay, I'm holding it up. Y'all are not confused enough to me. Y'all's is not color-coded, so, okay. Has the top community college formula funding recommendations. And where the commissioner differs from the community college is when you go down is they made no recommendation for performance funding, whereas the commissioner recommended $100 million. Number two is the critical fields. Historically, they received a 10% premium. The commissioner's recommending that not be included and that be included as part of incentive funding, assuming that we get that long term. What I did hear from Gary, from you, is that y'all think that the cost matrix has been adjusted where we're reflecting the accurate cost of the disciplines today.
Yes.
Okay. That's the response.
With the final phase-in of the 100% for the general academics, where the phase-in of the cost study, we will be reflecting the actual cost.
This is for
This
community
community
college.
college.
I know, but it's both.
Okay, for both. Okay. Developmental education, the key difference there is that both the committee as well as the commissioner are recommending $30 million and over and above, which has not been funded in the formula, but basically how that money is delivered, and that is the commissioner is recommending we use that, I don't know if these words, but to leverage that money to
Stimulate
identify
innovation.
best practices that we then can help drive down to all the institutions. No difference in the nursing growth supplement. On the small school supplement, there's a difference in the number of hours, that being under the committee recommendations that cover 60% of the institutions. Under the commissioner's recommendation, that would pick up 7 of the 50 institutions. And then no difference in alternate teacher certification, and the committee did not make any recommendation for dramatic growth, whereby the commissioner did make a recommendation to fund contact hours above 3% annual growth, which would put another $3.5 million in the formula. So
That, the $3.5 million, that doesn't go into the formula, that's trusteed. And then when they make that improvement in their growth, then we fund them for that amount.
So I guess what I'd ask, is there any more discussion on the differences or questions for community colleges? I'd like to go ahead and get those on the table for Dr. Anglin, if y'all have any questions on those differences at all before we call a motion.
Are we going to vote on the developmental education as a separate item?
No, that would be part of the entire formula funding recommendation. My proposal would be that we make a motion to adopt. I'm not making the motion, but the motion would be to adopt the full commissioner's recommendation. Now, we can modify that however we want to. If somebody wants to make that difference.
I would like to modify it to have the developmental education as a separate piece. Again, I just haven't been presented with enough evidence to make a recommendation on that item.
I have a question about that also, and I think what bothers me is it's sort of nebulous, how many incentives we use, and I wonder if you could use this more like incentive funding. In other words, in some kind of a chart, if you improve your rate by this, you get this. If we're just going to say, you all improve things, and we're not going to tell them how or provide the research or leadership or whatever, it seems to me that we ought to just ask them to improve their grades and give them the money.
But, in my mind, you raised a good question, Lynn. In my mind, I guess I had envisioned this $30 million being distributed according to Raymond's recommendations to the types of programs to which we've given star awards, for example, to invest and encourage that kind of innovation. That does have a subjective evaluation element to it.
But see, and we don't have that information. We don't have the detail on the 30 million, and we don't know the success that we should achieve from the 30 million. Now,
I agree, it's a trust me recommendation, I agree with you.
Well, I understand.
Not me, but trust Raymond.
But I also think we can be the leader here and look at, the big picture, which is a whole lot bigger than 30 million. But I would prefer for staff to come back with a later recommendation.
And then along the lines of Lynn's suggestion, which is to tie it to the kind of metrics that we've tied. We're going down a treacherous path of confusion here, though, with the legislature when it comes to incentive funding, is my only concern, my main concern.
I just, I know we have good intentions, but there's just so much, feel-good funding out here. I feel very nervous about not knowing what the money's going for and what we expect the outcome to be.
We can, if you would like, we can provide more definitive information about this. This money would be used to expand small-scale programs that we know are working. We have there's some math programs in the state that are working that involve 40, 50, 60 students. We know that learning communities have worked on certain campuses. We would fund from that 30 million the expansion of those programs. I mentioned the El Paso Community College program that has a lot of promise. We would expand that approach. There are institutions that are interested in developing more effective diagnostic tools. We would fund programs of that type. But what I don't want to do is this is premised on the notion we recognize that there are a number of different types of developmental education that aren't course-based. But we don't simply want to allocate that money without having some quality control measures. If you would like us to be more explicit about those, we'll be happy to provide you that information. Well, but yes, that's implicit in what we're doing. We're going to work with the, I mentioned before, we're bringing in experts from around the country that have developed model programs. We're looking at programs within the state that have worked very closely. We would bring the people from El Paso Community College to provide technical assistance workshops in the same way that with the College Connections program, it was so successful at ACC. We helped other institutions around the state develop their version of that.
Commissioner, where did the $30 million figure come from?
That was what we calculated as a 10% premium on those developmental ed hours that are already being taught.
Done differently.
And it was an estimate based on the community colleges estimating that 10% of developmental education activities are not covered by course-based funding.
Okay.
Could I make a recommendation that, to me, that seems to be the major impediment in the community college formula recommendation motion, is that, Commissioner, that the committee entertain a motion approving the Commissioner's recommendation as presented. I don't think I should make the motion, but with some detail to come back on developmental education at the board meeting. Our conversations should be much shorter next week on this. I mean, we have the entire board except one member here today. And so I think that if we give just a little bit more of a capsule of what that developmental education would look like, then is that...
Well, I just,
I'm not saying approve it. I'm saying that would be carved out, and then we'd look at that at the board meeting.
Separately.
That $30 million piece is what I would say.
Okay, so the motion wouldn't include the 30 million.
With that piece to come back to the full board when we're there next week.
Well, the motion, it could go either way, but what I was hearing you say is the motion would include a recommendation for 30 million additional new dollars, but how it's distributed would be reviewed by the board when the staff brings back the criteria by which the community colleges could trigger that 30 million. So that's different than just, or you just leaving it out altogether?
I mean, either one of them's fine with me, whether we carve it out now or we leave it in. I mean, I think
The
we
amount's
addressed it
not
at
in
the board
question.
meeting.
Yeah, it's not the amount, it's really the plan
The
itself.
process.
I think we recognize the need for enhancement and development of
Well,
education.
the plan and the administration of the plan is my issue.
So if that's the case, can I have a motion? Would somebody like to make that motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay.
But we took it out, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Brad, you're looking inquisitive.
It's,
Well, are we
The
moving
dollar-
this with phase-in?
The dollar amount is in,
oh, no.
It was, from what I understood, it was the three things. Really, we're going to completed hours in a phased approach with a benchmark of a do not cross line, do not go line if these dollars are not committed, a basic funding approach. The motion also included the amount of 30 million. However, the mechanism by which it was allocated is still in question.
No, the developmental ed is taken off completely and will be
Completely?
brought back for recommendation.
So we have a motion on the table.
I'll second Elaine's motion so we can have discussion.
Okay,
She already did.
First, I got to say, okay.
There's a little confusion on the motion.
I'm authenticating Brenda's motion, discussion on the motion.
Okay, then it's out.
Okay.
So you're accepting Brenda's friendly
Yes.
amendment to take the
out.
$30 million
It's completely
piece
out.
completely out of what the committee is voting on today?
Okay, so I think we have a motion on the table, discussion.
Just want to be clear that the total is not the one in question.
the 30
The
amount.
30 million is not in question. It's not part of the motion,
Right.
but moving to the board meeting on
Right.
next week, it's still 30 million. It's just a matter of
And what I'm hearing you say, the discussion next week should not be the 30 million, the discussion should be methodology for distribution of that $30 million.
Right.
Is that correct?
But
Lynn?
developmental ed is entirely out of the motion.
It's out of the motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry for the confusion, yes.
Okay.
Can I repeat this since I'm going to have to write it out between now and then? Okay, my understanding, and this is just my understanding, is that the motion is to move forward with completed semester credit or contact hours based on a phase-in of 37.5% with a minimum amount of funding, otherwise only fund on attempted hours, leaving out developmental education entirely. That will be discussed next week, and the amount to be discussed is going to be 30 million. The how to distribute the 30 million
That's
will
totally going to
be
be a different
discussed.
discussion.
I think the only thing you left out is that we will identify a minimum level
We
of
will
funding.
identify, right.
Okay.
We will be running runs.
And basically, it is to accept the commissioner's recommendation with the exception of developmental education with those 3 points.
Yes.
That's, in short, that's what
Okay.
the recommendation will do.
The recommended phase-in assumes a 4-year period.
Yes,
Ergo,
as
The
presented.
hybrid presentation we saw with
That's
the
correct.
average of 37.5% the first biennium.
That's correct.
So it's not 37.5%, it's 2550, 7,500. Okay.
Over the 4-year
Okay.
period.
I-
But on
We have a
average, it
motion
comes
on
out
the
to
table,
37.
and I've had a second. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed by the same sign. Okay, thank you. The second is the university formula funding recommendations, and again, if we can do the same exercise we just did for community colleges, that's looking at the
We're not going to take anything out of this one.
at the sheet we've got, and I'll walk down this very quickly. Completed versus attempted hours. Both the institutions and the commission are recommending performance funding, but in 2 different levels, one 100 amounts, 100 million, 178 million. I will also tell you that there's couple of differences there. One is that the institutions are recommending that be over and above the base. Commissioners recommending that be part of the base. And secondly, in our performance funding, there is no weighting for critical fields and at-risk students. And that's what, the reason for that is going to be recommended in the incentive funding, which we're going to take up in just a minute. The incentive funding, we focus specifically on at-risk and critical fields, and that's why the commissioner recommended we look at just total degrees, and that would include all levels of degrees. And then we're almost identical on terms of the infrastructure. If you look there, the key differences is a difference in how we phase in the small institution supplement. We really talk much about the small institution supplement. Any questions? I think the only one we haven't discussed in detail would be the small institution supplement. Dr. Rogers is recommending, the Formula Advisory Committee is recommending, as you get to 500, that 20% falls off.
5,000.
You get to 5,500, 20% of it falls off. 6,000, 40% falls off. So by you get 7,500, it's totally gone. And on ours,
It's a phase out from 4,000 to 6,000, and it's proportionate. It just, as you get closer to 6,000, it gets closer to zero.
So the basic difference is that the current cutoff of 5,000 is the beginning point of the phase-out in the committee's recommendation. It's the midpoint of the phase-out in the commissioner's recommendation.
Is there a rationale associated with that?
It was trying to get to a kind of a reasonable, if it's phased out, instead of dropping off at 5,000, that is a big hit. But phasing it out just seemed to make more sense. We're also recommending doing it over a 3-year average, so that if you're growing, it's going to actually take you a little bit longer to get there. So that way if you see a big fluctuation one way or another, it's not going to just drop you off automatically. And so it would be a 3-year phase-in, which is, I believe, actually part of their recommendation at the same time. It's a 3-year phase-in. Not phase-in, but a 3-year rolling average of that level.
Dr. Rogers, any comment on that at all as to the differences in those two?
It's very difficult to quantify.
I mean, you could pick one or the other.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Dr. Rogers? If not, would somebody entertain making a motion?
I will move the adoption of the commissioner's recommendations modified to phase in, move to completed hours over a 4-year period, 2 bienniums, 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%, and contingent on identifying the minimum level of funding increase necessary to keep any institutions from losing funds.
Mr. Heldenfels made a motion. Do I have a second? Second by Dr. Phillips. Any discussion? All those in favor indicate.
Yeah, I still have a question. Can I ask Dr. Rogers a question?
Sure, absolutely.
What was the feeling of the committee? Were they pretty much opposed to this across the board? Were there some representatives on the committee that were in favor and others not?
I'd say the majority of the committee was against using completed credit hours, or at least certainly against phasing in it all at once. There were, I think, a couple of representatives on the committee that were ready to go ahead with the phase-in. We were split, okay? But the majority basically didn't want to go to it.
That troubles me a lot. Philosophically, I'm there, but practically, when we're looking at differences in institutions across the state, differences in recruitment, differences in the kinds of students, it troubles me that we're setting some institutions up for an unfair disadvantage.
Well, a couple things that influenced my opinion as we thought about this over the last several weeks. One is that what we're recommending is contingent upon enough increase in funding that no one goes backwards. Number two, it was really interesting to me, this was alluded to earlier, and Dr. Rogers has since done his homework, but most institutions didn't know what their completion rates were when this came up. They scrambled to find out. But that tells me a lot, that they didn't know what their completion rates were. Number three, the gap we're talking about closing in performance is to go from the worst at 87% to the best at 97%. And that 10-point gap is a big gulf in 1 year, but phased in over 4 years, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. So that kind of put it in context for me. That's the performance gap we need to close.
Is there a way that we could go back to the committee between now and next week and just get input?
Well, what I was going to suggest is that, assuming that both the motions, this motion passes, is that Dr. Rogers and Dr. Anglin both go back to their committees, and we would, like to, any comments, feedback, we'd like you to give those back to us, and you might, it might even be appropriate to do that in writing so that we could present those even at the board meeting, so that the full board could have those subsequent to these two motions being passed before the board finally votes on it.
Thank you.
And whether there is agreement on these spreadsheets, because if these spreadsheets hold true, then the worry about being hurt goes away.
Right.
The big asterisk in the room is the funding level, obviously.
Yeah, we'll bring the spreadsheets that phase in run with the minimum levels.
But it'd be nice for the committee, because as Fred already has said, if these spreadsheets hold true, then we're not going to hurt anybody, but we are going to start transforming the way we look at our system.
That's a great idea, Ms. Mendoza. What we might do is run those and
We'll get them out to the
and then
committee.
get those out to the committee so that they can have
And
that
then they
to-
can comment on that. We don't, these committees have to be posted. We don't have 7 days to post them.
Right.
So, but we will get them out and ask them to comment on those and send the comments in, and we will distribute all the
Y'all can
comments.
consolidate the comments as
We'll
opposed
be
to
glad
y'all
to do that.
consolidating them. Yes, Dr. Phillips.
Oh,
I'm interested, I see that we are working to eliminate so institutions don't lose money, but I'm interested in how people feel about the fact that some institutions will have so much more money than the
Yes.
others.
I agree.
Because some institutions, I think we can safely say, that they have a lot more competition than some others.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know if they're concerned.
I think the committee would like to see this as more of an incentive rather than competing with each other, because if you hold the appropriation constant, it is possible to improve and still lose money. If you made it an incentive to increase your completer rate, even if you had to take it out, then as opposed to, there's not a problem with competing with each other, it's just that we are all so different. There is going to be a difference there. The concern is that you're just readjusting the funds internally as you improve or, go in the other direction. Does that kind of answer your question? That's one of the major concerns of the committee, is it's not taken outside of the base funding. It's just part of the base funding, and if you improve, and the other institutions do, it continues just to redistribute money.
On the other hand, if we phase it in, as I understand, page 5 of 6 of this legal size exhibit, that disparity in the allocation of the increased funds is narrowed a great deal. That's right. The average is 14.4%, and it looks to me like the range runs from a low of 12.5%, 11.9, a low, there it is, a low of 11.9 to a high of
15.
There's an 18.1 in there.
18.1.
Yeah, 18.1. So, as opposed to, as much as 40-something%.
If I could comment on the redistribution, one issue with the formula is that any change does this. In the current formula, there's some things built in like that as well.
Sure.
And we just need to understand that. Number one, if some institutions increase in enrollment more than others, there's a redistribution. Currently, the extent to which you keep your students in school from 1 year to the next, the same pool of students with enrollment increases, there's a differential in terms of, there's some schools that keep their students year after year till graduation, whether it's 4 or 5 or 6 years. Other schools, they'll stay there a semester, 2 semesters, 3 semesters, drop out or leave school for a few years. They'll come back later. And so they're essentially getting less for each of those students. Other schools heavily recruit from community colleges, and they bring in more students that way than some other schools who recruit very few community colleges, and they actually not increase their enrollments that way, but also increase their numbers of graduates. So what we always have to remember with the formula is there always are things built into it. We have things built into it now. Whenever you change the formula, it's always difficult. That people weren't really happy at one time with the teaching supplement, as I recall. Whenever it first came about, there were people who didn't want to do that initially because it made changes. And so the formula is very sensitive. And that's the concern of the institutions, that they do and do need to have a predictable base. And so that we have to remember that. And so, but any change can have some dramatic impacts.
And as David Zay explained, I think the thinking of the committee broadly was introducing more uncertainty, something we didn't want to do. But you're right, I'm certainly not disagreeing.
Dr. Rogers said it earlier that I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I think you used the analogy of, you realize the committee's recommendations were looking back at what your historical experience has been.
That's right.
As the commissioner's recommendations are trying to push us in the direction of looking forward to the results we want our higher education system to achieve. And so we're hoping that the phase-in and establishing that minimum level of funding increase allows us to look forward with a rear-view mirror, so to speak, to guard our backside still.
Yeah.
Good analogy.
Into my driving metaphor.
Plus the analyzation that'll come once we start introducing these changes and watching and giving us a time to adjust. So that's going to be critical as well.
Maybe the simplest way to put it is that the formulas that are currently constituted help us with our participation goal. What we're suggesting is we change the formula so they help us not only in terms of our participation goal in closing the gaps, but our success goal.
Performance.
No more discussion. I don't want any more comments. I think we have a motion on the floor from Mr. Heldenfels. I think it was seconded by Dr. Phillips. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed by the same sign. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you all very much. And we will get these new numbers out, Dr. Rogers, Dr. Angwin, to you, and then would welcome the comments back that we'll consolidate for the board.
Could I? I'm sure I'll be asked about this. I want to be sure before I get up. The proposal is basically remove the teaching supplement. Well, no, let's forget that. Okay. 300 million base. Okay. 178 success one. Okay. And then a phase-in of completers, starting with
37.5.
37.5. Okay.
For the biennium.
For the biennium.
Average should be 25 first year, 50
They only get
second
funded
year.
on
I see.
biennium, so we wouldn't have
Whatever.
any different numbers whatsoever.
Sure. I just wanted to say before you all left the table that although we came to a different conclusion about how we should proceed with formula funding, I am extremely grateful to the committees and extremely grateful to the thoughtfulness and the diligence that you showed in doing this work, and we really appreciate your hard work on these matters.
Yeah, for coming back.
Very much.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much.
Mr. Chair, quickly. I have to go.
Okay, we're losing one committee member.
Anybody want one?
So what I'd like to suggest is that we move on to agenda item 2C, and then I will entertain a motion to table the last two agenda items. Incentive funding, and believe it or not, incentive funding is not nearly as complicated as formula funding. We think we've got it where it's a little bit easier to understand. I just want to remind the committee that we were charged by the recent legislature, and that was Section 55, Article 358 of the General Appropriations Act, to come up with a recommendation for allocation of $100 million in incentive funding, and to present that to the governor and to the LBB for their consideration. We are well past our due date for that, and the reason for that is because simultaneously we have a task force that is meeting right now, and we'll meet again tomorrow, but we feel like we're at a point where to fulfill our statutory responsibility, we think it is appropriate for us to present a proposal to this committee for consideration for full adoption to the board. So, Susan, I'm going to let you.
Okay, and you will see a yellow supplemental agenda material, and I'm going to skip. Get back to this first table. We can speed through this pretty quick, and it says option 1, example, if implemented in FY07. And this is sorted in descending order. But basically, the column 1.
Susan, can I interrupt before
Okay.
you get into the chart? Let me just, I'd like to lay the premise for what is the foundational support for this recommendation. With the recommendations that this committee has just approved, we don't think you can look at incentive funding in a vacuum. We think it's critically important that you set the context of total funding. And so what we've tried to do is set out these new recommendations for formula funding, and included in those is a performance funding aspect to that. And that is focused not on at-risk and not critical field needs. On the other side, when we look at closing the gaps, we know that there are critical needs to fill, in all 4 areas, but we know in the critical fields and at-risk students, we've got to do a much better job than we're doing right now. And so, to set the context, this proposal is focused only on at-risk students in critical fields. The thought being that you're looking at funding in 2 different pieces. You have a formula funding recommendation here and incentive funding. And so the thought is you can't look at incentive funding without understanding what we just approved on formula funding. So it's set in the context of funding as a whole for higher education. So.
Okay, and sorry about that. I should have mentioned that. This column 1 is looking at degrees awarded, undergraduate degrees awarded, and it weights the critical fields and at-risk students as a weight of 1. A at-risk student in a critical field has a weight of 2. And basically looks at column 1 is a 3-year average, and it's proportioned out $30 million proportioned across all the institutions. Then we looked at this column 2, which goes across actually 4 columns, but column 2 shows the numeric increase for each institution, and then also the percentage increase for each institution. The institutions were grouped according to those with the top 25 percentile that had the highest percentage increase were group 1. The second 25 percentile, the 26th to 50th, are group 2, and then anybody below the mean increase, percentage increase, were group 3. Then dollars were allocated to group 1, was it 8? We'll check my cheat sheet. 8,000 per degree if you were in group 1, 4,000 per degree if you were in group 2, and 2,000 per degree if you were in group 3. And then that was normalized to get to 30 million. So taking that same proportion and getting to 30 million. Then the last column are innovation funds, and those are to help institutions who need help. They may not have some of the programs in place that the others. That is kind of seen as almost provide us with input, tie those funds to the uniform recruitment and retention programs that they have in place to help those institutions get up to a higher level to be able to more fully compete for some of these funds. And so then this is just sorted in descending order.
Are the groups based on the cost of the?
The groups are based on the percentage increase. So they're competing against themselves. So how much did you improve? And if you percentage-wise improve the most, then you're in that top group, the middle group, and then the bottom.
Lynn, there's really two measures. We're trying to simplify. We're bringing two measures. The first measure is absolute number of degrees produced, okay, in the critical fields of at-risk students. And there obviously is a bias towards larger institutions for column one, for obvious reasons, okay? So understanding that, we said, well, we also want to measure improvement and not just absolute production. So when you look at percentage improvement, that can have a bias towards smaller institutions if they're coming off a smaller base in terms of how much more they can improve. So that's the way the model was built, was to try to give, obviously, both of those are important, but to try to give equal emphasis to it. And you'll notice that this adds up to 80 million and not 100 million. As you remember, there's been 20 million of this, we think, that has been designated for top 10%. And so we're working off an assumption we have $80 million to allocate. I will say, go ahead.
I was going to also mention that this is in response to the rider in the appropriations bill. The task force is also working on a longer-term solution that will include the community colleges, but this recommendation strictly deals with what was included in the rider, the appropriations bill rider.
And which must be distributed prior to
It's
the end of fiscal
FY09,
09.
yes, it has to be distributed by 09 or it goes away, goes back to general fund.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to answer any questions in terms of working through this and the methodology, and we've been through several iterations of this.
Mr. Chairman, just a couple of comments. Obviously, in us looking at this, we keep talking about incentive money, but in reality, we're looking, backwards. It's like a bonus. And we're hopeful that the 178 million builds off this platform, and that really is true incentive looking out to the future. But with the task that we were faced with, we had no other alternative, but to look backwards. So as the chairman has said, we're weighted average 04, 05 against. 03, 04, 05 weighted average against 06.
With these numbers, right?
On these numbers. Now,
And
if
I have the numbers on my desk. I haven't looked at them.
the question we've been asking ourselves as we're working on it is, what does this look like if you use 07 and even 08 numbers? And
We're getting there.
okay.
They've been run, but they haven't been put into the model yet. So I have them run, but I just haven't gotten there yet.
Because they obviously will change.
Right. And that's why we have a big example if.
A key question I have is, and I have not brought this up, Commissioner, but it's in looking at the innovation funds. I really like the idea of the innovation funds. My concern is, are we too late to get them? Of course, innovation funds will have longer-term impacts, I know that, but there has been some discussion as to whether you not include the innovation funds for this $100 million and make the buckets $40 million each, as opposed to, and then look longer-term at, innovation funds. So that's, I also want to throw that out for discussion, if that's also a possibility, and we've looked at a couple of scenarios on that also. And Commissioner, you might just want to comment a little bit more on innovation funds and your thoughts about that.
Well, actually, the idea of the innovation funds came from some discussion of an issue that you raised earlier, Lori. There was a feeling that institutions had different levels of resources to be competitive for these incentive funds, that some institutions had internal resources, they had endowments, they had different capacity to raise money, whereas some institutions were almost wholly reliant on state funding to make any significant change in institutional priorities. So the Innovation Fund was a way of trying to give institutions that were starting behind in terms of being able to increase their number of degree recipients in critical fields, to get some money, to be able to put into place some programs that would help them become more competitive. And that was the idea. There has been a tremendous range of opinion about whether this is a good idea or not. And it's up to the board to consider, and it would be very easy to fold those innovation funds into the categories that you've already heard about.
One of the things that I think would be interesting to look at is when we first talked about an accountability system and we grouped like universities, like institutions, and how that would react to the innovation funds. Those like institutions probably have a lot of the same characteristics that we'd be looking at for this. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, I don't know that we would identify them in advance. We would, what we thought we would do, one way to do it would be you could put out an RFP and let institutions submit strategies for innovation and just do it on a merit basis. You would factor in where institutions are and their ability to compete for the $80 million in incentive funding. No, I think everybody would be eligible, but I think you might give different weights to different institutions based on available resources.
I do just want to point out, and the one I got, Susan did not have the sort that starts with the highest amount awarded going down to the least amount, which is your first sheet there. The only thing I think that's interesting is that one of the things that we want to do is to test the premise as to is this recognizing all different types of institutions that it does not.
Right.
And I think that's why we sorted it that way. When you look down, you'll see a UT Pan American in there, okay, for creative things that they're rolling out. So I think it was a confirmation of, or that I guess validated somewhat our methodology is what I'd say, is that there was what we thought a very diversified reward, diversification rewards among institutions. So, other questions, other comments from the committee? Any feelings about the Innovation Fund to leave it? I mean, any strong feelings as to leaving it in or including it in the proposal as shown here?
I can
Dr. Phillips.
understand why you want to have the proposals. On the other hand, it would be awfully good if you were able to see at first glance that there was a way for everybody to do this. Because I think without understanding it, people will just think, well, these guys will have the advantages in that too, you know. So I don't know, maybe we could come up with a way for it to be clear that there's going to be
Mr. Shea.
Mr. Chairman, I think we've run out of time, quite frankly. I think it's a great idea. We did not get an opportunity to fully develop it.
On the innovation.
On the innovation piece of we've gone down a lot of different rabbit trails, if you will, and I think it's important to move forward. As you had mentioned earlier, we actually are behind in terms of what our responsibilities were. I think the model is a good model, and my suggestion is let's go ahead and put the balance of the money, like you had suggested, or you had mentioned earlier, 40-40, and the 20 out there for top 10%, because we're here in April.
Yeah.
As Susan had mentioned, if this is going to go out the door anytime soon, which we hope that it will, it's got to be done. And I just think if we interject something else in there and try to figure it out, it's going to be very difficult.
It would also make it easier if that number allocated to top 10% scholarships goes up or down as well. All you got to do is split the difference.
You just move it. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
But it would not preclude us from fleshing out the idea of innovation funds and including that in the next legislative session's recommendation for incentive funding. So
Absolutely.
it's important to try to keep this concept alive.
And or for
It's
the
a very
task force
good
to
idea.
consider it.
Yeah, it's a good idea. It really is.
That's right, I think you're right, we need to double the money,
Yep.
split it back out.
Do I hear that as a motion for adoption with the modification that the innovation funds be eliminated?
If I was on the committee, I would,
Oh, you
but I'm
can't do
not
that.
on the committee.
How about somebody making that motion? Dr. Phillips, and second by Mr. Heldenfels, and that is a motion to approve this methodology as presented with the change that there will be no allocation for innovation funds and the money will be split equally in 40 million in the two pools. Any discussion?
Thank y'all for all the great work.
All those in favor indicate by saying aye. All those opposed, nay. Thank you. The motion carries. I would entertain a motion to defer the last two items on the agenda. You don't mind that, do you?
Mr. Chairman, we can defer it. I was just going to hand out the information. I would like the notes of our committee distributed, the notes of the task force distributed to the committee. We don't have those, but this is just step one of a three-step process. It's the task force of me and Elaine's recommendation on how to change and modify the project briefing sheets. And the one thing that's not here is that it's intended that the third page would become the one-page report card rather than the accountability system information that's currently in the book. So having said this cuts the volume of paper about in half.
And we will put this at the top of our agenda for the next meeting is what we'll do. But I know the P&S meeting is supposed to be starting in here now, and that's why I'm a little sensitive to that. So could I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
First and second. All in favor, indicate say aye. Thank you all very much. Here, Bob.